A boy called me at 3:18 a.m. He said, "Granddad, open the door, they are hunting me." My son had been dead for 6 years. I looked out the window and saw my 10-year-old grandson standing in the freezing Chicago snow. Then he looked up at me and said the words that shattered my reality. Mom told me Dad was murdered, and I am next. What I uncovered next destroyed a multi-million-dollar empire and sent 2 people to federal prison. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to fight to protect the ones you love. My name is Lawrence Hayes. I am 69 years old. For 40 years, I worked as a chief risk officer for one of the largest financial firms in Chicago. I spent my life calculating variables, predicting disasters, and protecting assets. I was a man who lived by logic, numbers, and absolute discipline. The harsh ring of the telephone shattered the perfect silence of my Southside brownstone. The digital clock on my nightstand read exactly 3:18 a.m. A phone call at this hour never brings good news. I answered the phone with the practiced calm of a man accustomed to midnight corporate emergencies. The voice on the other end was small, shivering, and breathless. It was Tyler, my 10-year-old grandson. I had not been allowed to see him or speak to him for 6 long years. His mother, Megan, severed all contact with me the very day we buried my son, Corey. Now Tyler was crying on the phone, begging me to open the front door before they found him. I grabbed my heavy wool robe and hurried down the hardwood stairs as fast as my legs could carry me. I disengaged the heavy brass deadbolt and pulled the thick oak door open. The freezing Chicago winter wind bit violently into my skin. Tyler stood on my porch, shivering uncontrollably in a thin autumn jacket that offered absolutely no protection against the bitter December cold. His face was pale, his lips were tinged blue. He clutched a small, worn backpack tightly against his chest. I pulled him inside immediately and locked the heavy door behind us. I wrapped my thick robe around his freezing shoulders and guided him toward the kitchen. I turned on the stove to heat water, asking him how he had managed to get here. Tyler looked at me with eyes that held far too much terror for a child his age. He explained that he sneaked out the back window of his house and took 2 night buses across the city to get to my neighborhood. He remembered my address from the few times Corey had brought him here as a toddler. I asked him why he ran away in the middle of the night. Tyler tightened his grip on his backpack. He looked directly into my eyes and delivered a message that stopped my heart from beating. He said Megan told her new husband that Corey did not die in an accident. She said Corey was murdered. Tyler then whispered that he heard them planning to get rid of him next. The sheer terror in his voice was not the product of a child's active imagination. It was the absolute dread of a boy who had looked evil in the face and barely escaped with his life. My blood ran completely cold. My only child, Corey, had died in a single car crash 6 years ago. The police ruled it a tragic accident caused by black ice on a dangerous mountain road. I had accepted that explanation because the overwhelming grief had blinded me to any other possibility. Now staring at my freezing grandson, the devastating truth hit me with the force of a freight train. My son was murdered and the killers were raising his child. Panic is a useless emotion in a crisis. During my 4 decades on Wall Street, I dismantled corrupt shell companies, managed hostile corporate takeovers, and navigated catastrophic market crashes. I learned to detach my emotions and focus entirely on the immediate tactical objective. I applied that exact same ruthless discipline right now. My grandson was in shock, hypothermic, and terrified. I needed to stabilize him before gathering any more intelligence. I poured him a mug of warm milk and honey. I wrapped a second thermal blanket around his small shoulders and sat across from him at my heavy mahogany dining table. I kept my voice perfectly level, projecting absolute authority and safety. I told Tyler he was secure in my house and that absolutely no one would ever hurt him here. As the warmth slowly returned to his cheeks, my mind began to process the massive implications of his words. Corey was 30 years old when his car veered off an embankment and plunged into a frozen ravine. He was a brilliant environmental surveyor, a man who loved the earth and fought fiercely to protect it from corporate greed. At the time of his death, he was working on a massive land assessment project for a powerful commercial developer. Megan, his wife, had always been a calculated, image-obsessed woman. She despised Corey's modest salary and constantly demanded a lavish lifestyle he refused to finance with dirty money. Exactly 11 months after Corey's funeral, Megan married Bradley Thorne, a ruthless corporate real estate developer. She upgraded from a modest suburban home to a sprawling mansion in the wealthiest district of the city. I had always suspected her rapid social ascension was distasteful, but I never possessed the hard evidence to accuse her of foul play. The police report regarding Corey's crash cited a catastrophic mechanical failure with the brakes. I had paid private investigators to look into it, but they found nothing conclusive. Megan held all the legal rights to Corey's estate and completely froze me out of the investigation. She weaponized her grief, playing the devastated widow to absolute perfection to gain the public's sympathy. Now, sitting in my kitchen, I realized the full horrifying scope of her deception. Tyler took a slow sip of his warm milk. He told me that Bradley and Megan had been arguing violently in Bradley's home office earlier that night. Tyler had hidden in the dark hallway and listened to every word. He heard Bradley yelling about a specific piece of land that Corey had hidden from them. He heard Megan scream that they had already killed the father, and they could easily arrange a tragic accident for the son if he became a legal obstacle to their plans. I absorbed this horrifying information without letting my composure crack even a fraction. I had promised Corey on his deathbed that I would protect his bloodline. I had failed him for 6 years. I would not fail him tonight. I stood up to retrieve a fresh set of warm clothes for Tyler from the guest room. I needed him comfortable before I called my attorney. The game had completely changed. I was no longer a grieving father mourning a tragic accident. I was an executioner gathering ammunition for a war. Before I could even cross the kitchen threshold, the sudden violent strobe of red and blue emergency lights flooded my living room windows. The flashing colors bounced off the hardwood floors and illuminated the walls with a harsh, aggressive glare. Tires screeched to a halt on the icy pavement right outside my front gate. Car doors slammed shut with heavy metallic thuds. Heavy combat boots pounded up the concrete steps of my front porch. The peaceful sanctuary of my home was breached in a matter of seconds. Tyler dropped his mug. It shattered on the floor, spilling warm milk across the polished wood. He scrambled backward, pressing himself into the dark corner of the kitchen, his eyes wide with absolute panic. He begged me not to let them take him back to that house. I placed a firm, reassuring hand on his shoulder and told him to stay completely out of sight. I walked to the front hallway just as a furious, continuous pounding began on my heavy oak door. A deep, authoritative voice demanded that I open the door immediately or they would breach it by physical force. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open slowly, maintaining a posture of absolute, unbothered calm. 2 armed Chicago police officers stood on my porch, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts. Behind them, wrapped in an expensive designer winter coat, stood Megan. Her face was a masterclass in theatrical devastation. She squeezed out fake tears and clutched her chest, playing the role of a hysterical, terrified mother whose child had been snatched in the night. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest and screamed that I had kidnapped her son. She told the officers that I was a delusional, estranged grandfather who had broken into her home and dragged her child into the freezing night. The officers immediately adopted an aggressive tactical stance. They ordered me to step out of the doorway and keep my hands completely visible at all times. They demanded to know where the boy was and threatened me with immediate arrest for felony abduction. The situation was a perfectly executed trap. Megan had undoubtedly tracked Tyler's cell phone or smartwatch the very moment she realized he was gone. She did not call me to ask if he was safe. She called the police to orchestrate a raid, framing me as a violent criminal to destroy my credibility and ensure I could never claim legal custody of my grandson. I stood facing the armed officers and the woman who had likely orchestrated my son's murder. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue or show any signs of anger. I looked directly into Megan's fake, tear-filled eyes with a coldness that made her step back. The war for my grandson's life had officially begun, and I was about to teach her exactly why my corporate rivals used to fear my name. The taller of the 2 officers stepped forward, his hand resting instinctively on the grip of his service weapon. He barked a sharp, aggressive order for me to step back slowly and keep my hands where he could clearly see them. Behind him, Megan amplified her performance. She let out a piercing, theatrical sob, clutching the lapels of her expensive designer coat, screaming that I had snatched her precious boy from his bed while they were sleeping peacefully. She told the officers I was mentally unstable, a bitter, grieving old man who had never accepted my son's tragic death and had developed a dangerous, unhealthy obsession with her child. Her tears looked incredibly authentic under the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the snow. The second officer unclipped his radio, calling for backup, clearly treating this as an active hostage situation. They pushed past me into the foyer, their heavy boots tracking dirty Chicago snow onto my antique rug. The lead officer shoved me hard against the wall, demanding to know where I had hidden the boy. He shouted questions at a rapid-fire pace designed to confuse and disorient a suspect. He asked if I was armed. He asked if I had drugged the child. He asked how I managed to break into a secure gated community in the dead of night. Every question was framed as a direct accusation, leaving absolutely no room for a defense. Megan stood in the doorway, covering her mouth with her hands, playing the devastated victim flawlessly. She wailed that I needed to be locked up in a psychiatric ward before I killed someone. She was establishing a narrative right there in my hallway, planting the seed of my supposed insanity into the official police record. The officers ordered me to turn around and place my hands flat against the floral wallpaper. One of them kicked my legs apart, preparing to cuff me. The tension in the room was suffocating. A single wrong move, a raised voice, or a flinch of anger from me would give them the legal justification to tackle me to the ground and haul me away in chains. Megan wanted me to lose my temper. She wanted me to scream and fight back to prove her fabricated story right. I did not give her the satisfaction. Over my 40 years as a chief risk officer, I had faced down federal auditors, hostile corporate raiders, and panic-driven board members during multi-billion-dollar market crashes. I survived those brutal corporate wars because I mastered the psychology of de-escalation. When a room reaches a boiling point, the man who controls his breathing controls the narrative. I kept my hands pressed firmly against the wall, entirely open and visible. I lowered the register of my voice, speaking in a slow, steady, and terrifyingly calm baritone. I informed the officers that I was completely unarmed, that I owned this property, and that I was fully cooperating with their investigation. My absolute lack of resistance instantly disrupted their adrenaline. The officer patting me down hesitated, expecting a violent fight that never came. I calmly instructed them to check my kitchen, stating that my grandson was sitting safely at the table with a mug of warm milk. I stated clearly for their body cameras that Tyler had arrived on my porch alone at exactly 3:18 in the morning, shivering and seeking refuge. I did not hurl wild insults at Megan. I did not accuse her of murder or corporate fraud. I simply offered the officers empirical facts. I informed them that my front porch was equipped with a high-definition security camera which had recorded Tyler walking up the steps entirely by himself. I offered to hand over the hard drive immediately to clear up any misunderstanding regarding a kidnapping. My absolute logic cut through Megan's hysterical screaming like a surgical scalpel. The lead officer took a step back, realizing the situation did not match the frantic emergency call they had received. He signaled his partner to check the kitchen. When the second officer found Tyler unharmed and sipping milk, the immediate threat of violence evaporated. I turned around slowly, keeping my movements deliberate and non-threatening. I looked at Megan. Her fake tears faltered for a fraction of a second. She recognized the look in my eyes. It was the exact same look I used before liquidating a rival firm. She realized I was not a fragile old man she could easily bulldoze with a cheap theatrical display. I had neutralized the police, but I also knew the cold, hard reality of the law. Megan was the boy's sole legal guardian. Without a court order, I had no legal authority to keep Tyler in my house. The lead officer sighed, holstering his radio. He informed me that while there would be no kidnapping charges tonight, Tyler had to return home with his mother immediately. I did not argue. Arguing against established family law in a late-night police encounter is a battle you cannot win. The second officer gently escorted Tyler out of the kitchen. The boy looked completely defeated. His small shoulders slumped under the weight of his oversized winter jacket. Megan lunged forward, grabbing Tyler by the arm with a grip that was far too tight for comfort. She yanked him toward her, putting on a sickening display of maternal relief for the police, kissing his forehead while her fingers dug painfully into his shoulder. Tyler did not hug her back. His eyes were wide with a silent, desperate terror. He looked at me silently, begging me not to let them take him back to the man who wanted him dead. I held his gaze, nodding once, a silent promise that this war was far from over. As Megan dragged him toward the front door, Tyler purposely stumbled over the heavy welcome mat. He fell hard onto his knees, knocking over my wooden coat rack and a clatter of winter coats and umbrellas. The officers instinctively stepped back to give him room. I knelt beside him instantly to help him up. Megan hissed at me to stay away from her son, but for one brief, chaotic second, Tyler and I were shielded by the fallen coats. He reached out and grabbed my hand to pull himself up. In that split second of physical contact, I felt him press something small, hard, and metallic directly into my palm. I closed my fist, instantly sliding the object deep inside my robe pocket before anyone could notice. Tyler stood up, brushing the snow off his knees, his face suddenly resolute. Megan hauled him out the door and down the icy steps, shoving him into the back of her idling luxury SUV. The police gave me a final warning to contact family court if I wanted visitation rights, then turned and walked back to their patrol cars. I stood alone in the freezing doorway watching the red taillights of Megan's vehicle disappear into the dark Chicago night. The silence returned to my house, but the air was charged with a dangerous new energy. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the object Tyler had risked everything to give me. It was a heavy military-grade USB flash drive. It was cold to the touch and encased in reinforced steel. My grandson had not just brought me a warning, he had brought me a weapon. I carried the heavy steel drive into my basement study, locking the reinforced door behind me. I drew the heavy blackout curtains over the small, high windows, ensuring complete isolation from the street above. The study was my sanctuary, a room lined with floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves and filled with the scent of old paper and leather. At the center of the room sat my custom-built air-gapped terminal. It was a standalone computer entirely disconnected from the internet, completely immune to remote hacking, wireless tracking, or external surveillance. I booted up the system, listening to the quiet hum of the cooling fan, which was the only sound in the room. I held the metallic drive in my palm for a moment, feeling the cold weight of my son's final desperate act. Corey had known he was being hunted. He had known his life was in imminent danger, and he had engineered this digital vault to survive him. I slid the drive into the port. The screen immediately flashed black. A moment later, a sequence of stark red text crawled across the monitor. It was a custom cryptographic lock, military-grade and ruthlessly efficient. A prompt appeared demanding a 16-character alphanumeric key. Beneath the text bar, a digital countdown timer blinked with a terrifying warning. 3 attempts remaining before total data purge. It was a self-destruct protocol. If I failed to enter the exact sequence of letters and numbers, the drive would permanently fry its own memory circuits, erasing the only proof of my son's murder and my grandson's impending doom. I sat back in my leather chair, staring at the flashing red cursor. This was not a standard password. Corey was a highly intelligent environmental surveyor, a man who understood data security and operational risk. He knew Megan might find the drive. He knew Bradley Thorne's corporate thugs might seize it. He needed a password that only one person on Earth could deduce. He needed a key that I would understand. I leaned forward and typed in the alphanumeric sequence of his old childhood home security code, a string of numbers and letters he had used for his earliest bank accounts. I hit enter. The screen flashed a brilliant angry crimson. 2 attempts remaining. The tension in the room thickened, pressing heavily against my chest. Panic is the ultimate enemy of calculation. I closed my eyes and drew upon my 4 decades of experience as a chief risk officer. When you need to crack a dead man's cipher, you do not guess blindly. You profile the architect of the lock. You break down their behavioral patterns, their psychological anchors, and their fundamental motivations. I had to think exactly like Corey. I had to remember the lessons I taught him within these very walls. When Corey was a teenager, I did not teach him how to play sports. I taught him the mathematics of risk management. I taught him how to look for hidden patterns in chaos. Our greatest shared bond was my extensive collection of vintage jazz vinyl records. We spent countless Sunday evenings in this study, listening to the intricate mathematical improvisations of the jazz greats. I taught him that true security, just like a brilliant jazz solo, relies on a structured foundation hidden beneath a layer of apparent randomness. A 16-character code designed specifically for me would undoubtedly be anchored in those Sunday evenings. It had to be a shared memory, something Megan would never know, and Bradley Thorne could never buy. I thought about the day Corey packed his bags for college. He had asked to take exactly 1 record from my prized collection to keep in his dorm room. It was an original pressing of John Coltrane's masterpiece. I had made him memorize the unique matrix number etched into the vinyl runout groove, the code that proved its authenticity. I typed the first few digits of that serial code into the terminal. My finger hovered over the enter key. If I was wrong, I would only have 1 single chance left. I pressed the key. The red screen flashed violently again. 1 attempt remaining. Total data purge imminent. A bead of cold sweat rolled down the side of my neck. I had to pivot my strategy immediately. Corey was trying to send me a message from beyond the grave. The code was not just a memory, it was a lifeline. I thought about Tyler freezing on my porch, repeating the warning that they were hunting him. I thought about Corey, cornered and desperate, creating this drive. He would not use a simple catalog number. He would use the exact phrase we bonded over combined with the year of the record that defined our relationship. ALOVESUPREME 1964. I counted the letters and numbers in my head, exactly 16 characters. It was the album he took with him, the music that framed our deepest conversations, and the year the record was pressed. I centered my breathing, placed my hands on the keyboard, and typed the sequence. ALOVESUPREME 1964. I pressed enter, bracing myself for the screen to go dark forever. The aggressive red text vanished instantly. The monitor flickered, transitioning to a bright clinical white. A green progress bar raced across the bottom of the screen, followed by the soft confirming chime of an unlocked drive. A massive directory of encrypted folders cascaded onto my desktop. I had broken the lock. I immediately opened the primary master file labeled with a series of geographical coordinates. As my eyes scanned the digitized documents, the full horrifying magnitude of my son's murder finally materialized. The files contained thousands of pages of deeply technical soil samples, chemical analysis reports, internal corporate emails, and heavily redacted bank ledgers. Corey had meticulously compiled a devastating, undeniable dossier against Bradley Thorne's Real Estate Development Corporation. The soil samples were taken from the exact geographical center of the city, a massive industrial wasteland currently undergoing rapid gentrification. The reports detailed catastrophic levels of illegal environmental pollution. Bradley Thorne's company had actively dumped highly toxic industrial waste, lethal carcinogens, and dangerous heavy metals directly into the bedrock of the city's largest upcoming commercial zone. They had deliberately poisoned the groundwater to save $50 million in mandatory environmental disposal fees. The internal emails forwarded from a secure whistleblower server explicitly showed Bradley Thorne ordering the illegal dumping to cut costs and accelerate the construction timeline. I opened the flagship project brief. Bradley was currently breaking ground on a $500 million mega development on that exact poisoned land. It was slated to be a glittering expanse of luxury condominiums, upscale retail centers, and pristine corporate offices. It was Bradley's absolute crown jewel, the project that would cement his legacy among the city's billionaire elite. If the Environmental Protection Agency ever saw these soil samples, the entire mega development would be immediately condemned. The land would be declared a federal hazard zone, the investors would lose everything, and Bradley Thorne would face decades in federal prison. Corey had the absolute proof. He was scheduled to meet with an EPA director the exact same morning his car miraculously veered off a mountain road. My son was not the victim of black ice. He was silenced to protect a $500 million empire. Bradley and Megan murdered my boy to build their obscene wealth on poisoned ground. I highlighted every single file and initiated a secure hard copy print sequence, the printer word to life churning out the damning evidence page by page. The scale of the enemy was incredibly vast, backed by limitless corporate funds and violent resources. But as I stacked the warm papers on my mahogany desk, my grief completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, lethal clarity. They had the money, but I had the blueprint to tear their empire down to the poisoned dirt. I sat at my mahogany desk as the heavy printer finished dispensing the last of the encrypted files. I arranged the documents into precise stacks, slipping on my reading glasses to begin the forensic audit. The numbers laid out before me were stark, undeniable, and dripping with blood. For hours, the only sound in the basement study was the sharp rustle of paper and the scratch of my fountain pen. I traced the flow of capital with the precision of a seasoned predator. Bradley Thorne's Development Corporation had acquired the Central City Industrial Zone at a shockingly low market value. They were fully aware of the severe chemical contamination hidden beneath the topsoil. The federal mandate required a total excavation and purification of the bedrock before a single foundation could be poured. The estimated cost of this mandatory environmental remediation was exactly $50 million. I cross-referenced the corporate ledgers with the construction timelines. Bradley had entirely bypassed the purification phase. He funneled a fraction of that $50 million into a labyrinth of offshore shell companies and corrupt municipal inspectors to falsify the safety permits. He literally buried lethal carcinogens beneath tons of cheap concrete, effectively building his $500 million luxury mega-development on top of a ticking toxic time bomb. Corey had been the lead environmental surveyor assigned to the initial assessment phase. I reviewed his personal communications log, heavily encrypted within the drive. He had confronted Bradley directly in private, demanding an immediate halt to the construction. When Bradley threatened his career, Corey bypassed the corporate hierarchy and prepared a comprehensive whistleblower dossier for the Environmental Protection Agency. He had meticulously cataloged the forged permits, the bribed inspectors, and the lethal soil samples. My son was not merely a surveyor doing his job. He was an honorable man standing directly in the path of a ruthless corporate machine. He was going to expose the $50 million fraud and completely destroy Bradley's empire. He was silenced the very morning he was scheduled to deliver this evidence to federal authorities. I stared at the financial timelines, feeling a cold, calculating rage replace the lingering remnants of my grief. The timeline of Bradley's financial maneuvering aligned perfectly with the tragic trajectory of my son's life. But Bradley Thorne could not have orchestrated Corey's murder alone. He needed intimate inside access to Corey's schedule, his vehicle, and his exact movements on that fatal morning. I pulled up the personal banking records Corey had meticulously archived. I examined the joint accounts he shared with Megan during the final year of their marriage. Megan had always complained about Corey's modest lifestyle. She despised our South Side roots and relentlessly demanded a level of luxury Corey absolutely refused to finance through unethical corporate practices. The ledgers revealed a sudden, unexplained influx of wealth into Megan's personal spending accounts just weeks before Corey's death. She was purchasing designer clothes, expensive jewelry, and booking exclusive spa retreats while Corey was working grueling hours to compile his whistleblower report. The pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. Megan had discovered Corey's hidden dossier. She recognized the immense financial threat it posed to Bradley Thorne's company. Instead of supporting her husband, she saw an opportunity for unprecedented social ascension. She approached Bradley directly, offering him the exact time and route Corey would take to the EPA office in exchange for a seat at Bradley's billionaire table. She traded the life of a brilliant, honest man for a sprawling mansion in the wealthiest district of Chicago. Exactly 11 months after the staged accident, she married the man who ordered the hit on her husband. She played the devastated, grieving widow to absolute perfection, collecting Corey's $5 million life insurance payout and instantly merging it with Bradley's bloody real estate fortune. She sold my son for $50 million in corporate savings and a life of absolute luxury. I placed my pen down on the mahogany desk. Megan believed she had successfully buried her sins beneath the frozen ravine and the polished marble of her new mansion. She assumed she had completely outsmarted a retired accountant. She did not realize I had spent 40 years destroying executives far more intelligent and ruthless than her new husband. I continued my forensic audit, digging deeper into the final folder Corey had encrypted on the drive. It was labeled as a personal trust completely detached from his corporate surveying work. I opened the digital file and found a certified notarized land deed. I leaned closer to the monitor, reading the complex legal jargon with mounting disbelief and sudden profound pride. My son was a brilliant tactician. He knew Megan was compromised. He knew Bradley Thorne would try to eliminate him to secure the development zone. Corey had quietly purchased a 5-acre parcel of land directly in the geographical center of the proposed mega-development. This specific plot was completely unpolluted, sitting on a solid, clean bedrock ridge surrounded by the toxic wasteland. I cross-referenced the geographical coordinates with Bradley's master construction blueprint. The 5-acre parcel was the exact location slated for the primary access road, the central water purification plant, and the main utility grid for the entire $500 million project. Bradley Thorne could not lay a single pipe, pour a single foundation, or open a single building without routing his critical infrastructure directly through that specific piece of land. Without it, his $500 million project was entirely worthless, a stranded island of contaminated dirt. Corey had not put the land in his own name, nor had he left it in the joint estate he shared with Megan. He had executed an irrevocable ironclad legal trust. He deeded the 5-acre parcel entirely to Tyler. My grandson was the sole uncontested owner of the most critical piece of real estate in the city. The trust stipulated that no guardian, including Megan, could sell or transfer the land without a secondary authorization from an independent executor. I scrolled to the bottom of the legal document to identify the executor. It was me. Corey had made me the absolute legal gatekeeper of Bradley Thorne's empire. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This was why Megan and Bradley were hunting Tyler. They did not care about the boy. They had recently discovered the existence of the trust. They realized their $500 million development was legally paralyzed by a 10-year-old child and a grandfather they had alienated. To save their corrupt empire, they needed to seize control of Tyler's estate, and to do that, they needed to completely neutralize Tyler. The war was no longer just about exposing a murder. It was an immediate, desperate race to save my grandson's life from the exact same corporate predators who slaughtered his father. The sharp knock on my front door came exactly at 8 in the morning. I had not slept a single minute. The documents from Corey's encrypted drive were still spread across my mahogany desk. I walked to the foyer, expecting another squad of aggressive police officers. Instead, I found a young man in a cheap suit holding a thick manila envelope. He asked if I was Lawrence Hayes. When I confirmed my identity, he shoved the envelope against my chest, stated I was officially served, and hurried down the icy steps. I locked the deadbolt and tore the envelope open right there in the hallway. I expected a standard restraining order or an injunction regarding my interaction with Tyler. What I found was a weapon of absolute terrifying cruelty. It was an emergency ex parte petition filed in family court by Megan and Bradley Thorne. They were actively petitioning a judge to declare my 10-year-old grandson completely mentally incompetent. The legal filings claimed Tyler was suffering from severe, violent onset psychosis. Megan had submitted a sworn affidavit stating that Tyler was a danger to himself and others, prone to extreme hallucinations and violent outbursts. The petition demanded that Tyler be immediately transferred to a highly secure, locked-down state psychiatric ward for intensive, lifelong treatment. The true motive, however, was buried deep in the financial addendums attached to the back of the petition. Megan and Bradley were requesting the court grant them emergency conservatorship over all of Tyler's existing assets, specifically demanding the immediate liquidation of any land trusts in his name to finance his supposed lifelong medical care. My blood boiled with a pure, concentrated fury. They did not just want to steal the 5-acre parcel of land blocking their $500 million development. They were fully prepared to lock a perfectly healthy, terrified 10-year-old boy in a chemical prison for the rest of his life. They were going to drug my grandson into a permanent stupor to seize the dirt beneath his feet. The sheer evil of their strategy was breathtaking. They were using the legal system to execute a bloodless murder. They knew a dead child would draw federal investigations, especially after Corey's suspicious crash. A severely medicated, institutionalized child, however, was just a tragic family misfortune that no one would ever question. I gripped the papers so tightly my knuckles turned gray. They had crossed a line that guaranteed their absolute destruction. I carried the thick stack of legal filings down into my basement study, laying them out beside Corey's environmental reports. I needed to identify the exact mechanism they were using to legitimize this horrific psychiatric trap. I flipped directly to the medical evaluations appended to the petition. They were signed by a Dr. Alistair Croft, a prominent private psychiatrist who operated a highly exclusive clinic in the Gold Coast district. Megan and Bradley had submitted 3 separate evaluations, all signed by Croft, detailing Tyler's supposed descent into violent madness over the past 4 weeks. I sat back in my leather chair and stared at the doctor's signature. During my 40 years as a chief risk officer, I did not just balance corporate ledgers. My primary function was identifying internal corporate liabilities, which often meant auditing the extreme unethical behaviors of high-level executives. I possessed an eidetic memory for fraudulent patterns. I remembered Dr. Alistair Croft very clearly. 15 years ago, I audited a massive expense account abuse case involving 3 senior vice presidents at my firm. They were using corporate funds to secure highly unethical, off-the-books prescriptions for stress management and performance enhancement. The man writing those illegal prescriptions to keep burnt-out executives functioning was Dr. Alistair Croft. He was not a healer. He was a high-society mercenary, armed with a medical degree, perfectly willing to fabricate diagnoses for anyone who could afford his exorbitant, unrecorded cash fees. I immediately booted up my secure air-gapped terminal and began running a forensic financial trace on Croft's private clinic. I did not need a subpoena. I knew exactly how to navigate public property records and corporate lease agreements. Within 20 minutes, I found the critical point of leverage. Dr. Croft did not own the building where his lucrative clinic operated. He leased the entire top floor from a commercial real estate holding company. I traced the holding company through 2 layers of generic LLCs, stripping away the corporate camouflage. The building was owned entirely by Bradley Thorne. Croft was not an independent medical professional evaluating a child in distress. He was a tenant directly on Bradley's payroll. Bradley was essentially threatening to evict Croft's highly illegal pill mill unless the doctor provided the exact psychiatric paperwork required to lobotomize my grandson. The medical evaluation was an absolute forgery, a transactional piece of paper bought and paid for to secure a $500 million real estate deal. I printed the lease agreements and placed them next to the forged medical evaluations. The architecture of their conspiracy was perfectly clear. They had constructed a flawless legal trap utilizing a compromised medical professional to rubber stamp the theft of Tyler's inheritance. I checked the court summons attached to the front of the petition. The emergency ex parte hearing was scheduled for exactly 72 hours from now. I had 3 days before a judge slammed a gavel and legally handed Tyler over to a state psychiatric ward. I picked up my fountain pen, assessing my immediate defensive options. Family court is an arena governed by optics, emotion, and systemic bias. If I walked into that courtroom as a 69-year-old estranged grandfather shouting conspiracy theories about environmental fraud and corporate murder, I would sound exactly like the delusional, dangerous old man Megan claimed I was. The judge would see Megan as a weeping, wealthy mother desperately trying to save her violently ill son, completely backed by the limitless legal resources of a prominent billionaire developer. Furthermore, they held the ultimate trump card of a signed evaluation from a licensed, prestigious psychiatrist. If I tried to fight them in family court, I would lose entirely. I would be permanently barred from seeing Tyler, and he would be injected with heavy antipsychotics before the week was over. I placed the pen down on the mahogany desk. I could not fight Bradley Thorne in a courtroom designed for domestic disputes. To save my grandson from a chemical prison, I had to completely obliterate Bradley on the battlefield I had dominated for 4 decades. I had to rip his financial empire out from under him. I reached into the bottom drawer of my desk and retrieved a heavily encrypted burner phone. I turned it on and dialed a private number I had not called since my retirement. The phone rang twice before a sharp, analytical voice answered. It was Gregory Shaw. Gregory was a ruthless, brilliant corporate attorney who operated in the darkest, most aggressive corners of corporate law. 20 years ago, I saved Gregory from a devastating federal indictment dismantling a trap set by his rivals. He owed me his entire career, his freedom, and his absolute loyalty. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told Gregory that I was coming out of retirement and I required his immediate presence in my study. I instructed him to bring his most aggressive financial mapping software. I told him we were going to completely dismantle a $500 million real estate developer in less than 72 hours. Gregory did not hesitate or ask questions. He simply told me he would be at my door in 30 minutes. I hung up the phone and looked at the forged medical papers. Megan and Bradley thought they were hunting a vulnerable child. They were about to discover they had kicked awake a sleeping Leviathan. Gregory Shaw arrived at my front door exactly 28 minutes after I ended the call. He did not knock. He used the emergency keypad code I had given him 15 years ago, stepping into my foyer with the silent efficiency of a man accustomed to operating in the shadows. Gregory wore a meticulously tailored charcoal suit, his silver briefcase gripped tightly in his right hand. He was 55 years old, possessing the sharp, predatory eyes of a great white shark. In the corporate legal sector, Gregory was known as the Undertaker. Companies hired him when they needed to quietly bury a scandal or ruthlessly dismantle a competitor without leaving legal fingerprints. He walked directly past the kitchen and followed me down the narrow stairs into the basement study. I engaged the heavy steel deadbolt behind us, securing the room. I did not offer him a drink or engage in small talk. I pointed to the massive whiteboard taking up the far wall and handed him a dry erase marker. I told Gregory that Bradley Thorne, the billionaire real estate developer, was currently petitioning family court to lock my 10-year-old grandson in a psychiatric ward to steal a 5-acre land trust. I told him we had exactly 68 hours left before a corrupt judge signed the medical commitment papers. I instructed Gregory to forget about family law restraining orders and custody battles. We were not going to fight Bradley in a courtroom where he held the advantage. We were going to obliterate his entire corporate existence. Gregory did not flinch. He did not express shock or offer empty condolences regarding my grandson. He simply unclasped his silver briefcase, booted up his encrypted laptop, and synced it to my air-gapped terminal. He projected Bradley Thorne's corporate umbrella onto the large monitor on my wall. It was a labyrinth of shell companies holding firms and offshore accounts designed to project the illusion of infinite wealth. Gregory stated that cracking a structure this dense usually required months of forensic litigation and a small army of federal auditors. I told him we did not have months. We had less than 3 days, and I intended to burn Bradley's empire to the ground by sunrise. Gregory adjusted his glasses. his fingers flying across the keyboard as he initiated the financial mapping protocols. He warned me that Bradley Thorne was an apex predator in the real estate sector, insulated by hundreds of millions of dollars in corporate backing. To launch a direct financial strike against a man with that level of capital, we needed resources that far exceeded the pension of a retired executive. Gregory turned his laptop screen toward me, displaying the massive financial fortifications protecting Bradley Thorne. He explained that initiating a hostile legal offensive would require an immediate liquid capital injection of at least $30 million just to tie up Bradley's countersuits. Gregory looked around my modest wood-paneled study and stated plainly that we lacked the financial ammunition to fight a war of attrition. He assumed, like everyone else in Chicago, including my former daughter-in-law, that my retirement consisted of a comfortable company pension and a paid-off brownstone. He assumed I lived a quiet, frugal life because that was the absolute limit of my means. I reached across the desk and typed a sequence of override commands into my secure terminal. I opened a hidden, heavily encrypted directory and projected my personal financial portfolios onto the main monitor right beside Bradley Thorne's corporate web. I watched Gregory's eyes widen as he processed the numbers scrolling across the screen. During my 4 decades as the chief risk officer for one of the most powerful financial institutions on the planet, I did not simply collect a salary. I possessed unparalleled insight into global market fluctuations, emerging technology sectors, and distressed asset acquisitions. My severance package alone had been an 8-figure sum carefully negotiated to ensure my absolute silence regarding the firm's internal operations. But that was merely the foundation. Over the past 40 years, I had quietly and ruthlessly invested in blind trusts, dark pool funds, and untouchable offshore portfolios. I never bought sports cars, yachts, or sprawling mansions. I reinvested every single dividend, compounding my wealth in absolute secrecy. True power does not crave an audience. True power thrives in anonymity. The numbers glowing on the monitor confirmed that my liquid net worth vastly exceeded $300 million. Gregory stared at the screen in complete silence, absorbing the reality that the modest man sitting across from him possessed more accessible capital than the billionaire we were targeting. Bradley Thorne's wealth was entirely locked up in concrete steel and speculative real estate valuations. My wealth was completely liquid, untraceable, and ready to be deployed instantly. I looked at Gregory and told him the funding for this war was secured. I authorized him to draw whatever capital he required from my primary ghost accounts. I did not want a prolonged legal battle. I wanted a surgical, devastating strike that would sever Bradley's financial arteries before he even realized he was bleeding. Gregory closed his mouth, a slow, predatory smile creeping across his face. He turned back to the keyboard with renewed ferocity, understanding that he was no longer tasked with defending a desperate grandfather. He was acting as the general for an invisible financial superpower. Gregory's fingers danced across the keyboard, tearing through Bradley Thorne's corporate defenses with surgical precision. We bypassed the public relations facades and dug directly into the raw, unedited ledgers of the $500 million mega development. It took Gregory exactly 2 hours to isolate the fatal structural flaw hidden deep within the financial architecture of Bradley's empire. Gregory pulled up a series of highly classified loan agreements and highlighted a specific clause in bright yellow. He explained that Bradley was projecting the image of a self-made billionaire, but his entire operation was a fragile house of cards built on massive, unsustainable debt. To secure the central city land and begin immediate construction, Bradley had bypassed traditional, highly regulated commercial banks. Instead, he financed the entire $500 million project through a single, brutally aggressive private equity firm in New York. He had taken out a massive, over-leveraged mezzanine loan. Mezzanine debt is toxic. It carries exorbitant interest rates and draconian penalty clauses designed specifically for desperate developers who need immediate cash. Gregory zoomed in on the collateral agreement. Bradley had leveraged every single asset he owned to secure that loan. He pledged his holding companies, his construction equipment, his future profits, and even the deed to his own sprawling personal mansion. The contract contained a lethal trigger clause. If the private equity firm deemed the project a high-risk failure, or if Bradley missed a single critical development milestone, the lender had the legal right to call in the entire debt immediately. If Bradley could not pay the full $500 million within 24 hours of the demand, the lender would seize everything, leaving Bradley completely bankrupt and homeless. Gregory tapped the screen, stating that Bradley was sweating because the primary milestone was securing the unpolluted 5-acre access parcel currently held in my grandson's trust. Without that land, the project was dead, and the debt would detonate. Gregory suggested we leak Corey's environmental fraud evidence to the New York equity firm, hoping they would panic and cancel the loan. I stared at the toxic debt agreement on the screen, feeling a cold, absolute certainty settle over me. I told Gregory we were not going to leak anything to the New York firm. Leaking information surrendered control of the narrative, and I leave absolutely nothing to chance. I ordered Gregory to contact the private equity firm immediately through our blind proxy corporation. I told him to offer them a 20% premium above market value to purchase Bradley Thorne's mezzanine debt portfolio tonight. Gregory stopped typing, his eyes locking onto mine as he realized the sheer, horrifying magnitude of my strategy. We were not going to fight Bradley's lawyers in family court. We were going to buy his debt. I was going to become his bank, his executioner, and the absolute master of his fate. Gregory stared at me for exactly 3 seconds before his predatory smile returned wider and sharper than before. He did not waste time pointing out the unprecedented aggression of buying $500 million in distressed mezzanine debt. He simply opened a secure communication channel directly to the senior partners at the New York private equity firm. The time was currently 2:14 in the morning. Financial empires are not conquered during business hours. They are slaughtered in the dead of night when the targets are fast asleep. I authorized the transfer of the massive capital requirement from 3 of my most heavily fortified offshore ghost accounts. The money moved through a complex labyrinth of encrypted digital relays, completely washing away any trace of my identity. Gregory established a blind proxy corporation named Vanguard Apex Acquisitions to serve as the official purchasing entity. When he connected with the New York executives, he did not negotiate. He presented a brutal take-it-or-leave-it ultimatum. Vanguard Apex would purchase the entirety of Bradley Thorne's debt portfolio at a 20% premium above its current market valuation, provided the transaction was executed and legally bound before sunrise. The New York firm was heavily exposed by Bradley's toxic development. They knew the project was stalling, and they were secretly terrified of an imminent default. Offering them a massive guaranteed cash profit to walk away was an offer no rational equity board could ever refuse. I watched the live feed on my terminal as digital signatures were verified and heavily encrypted contracts were countersigned across state lines. The New York firm surrendered their position completely without asking a single question about our identity. By 4:12 in the morning, the transfer was absolute and irrevocable. I was no longer a grieving father hiding in a Southside basement. I was the supreme, uncontested owner of Bradley Thorne's entire corporate existence. I owned the massive mortgage on his sprawling mansion. I owned the heavy construction equipment sitting idle on his poisoned dirt. I owned his future, and I held the absolute legal right to completely orchestrate his ruin. Buying the debt was only the initial phase of the execution. During my tenure as a chief risk officer, I witnessed countless arrogant developers escape absolute ruin by securing 11th-hour bailout loans from secondary lenders. A cornered corporate animal will chew off its own leg to survive, leveraging personal favors, shadow investors, and high-interest bridge loans to keep their operations breathing. I was not going to give Bradley Thorne the opportunity to chew off a leg. I was going to surgically remove all oxygen from his environment. I instructed Gregory to initiate a scorched earth protocol across the entire commercial lending sector. I utilized my extensive network of anonymous financial informants to systematically poison Bradley's corporate credibility. Gregory drafted highly confidential anonymous risk advisories hinting at severe environmental irregularities and impending federal audits surrounding Bradley's mega development. We quietly distributed these advisories to every major commercial bank, private hedge fund, and shadow lender operating within the Chicago metropolitan area. In the high-stakes financial sector, perception instantly dictates reality. If the banks even suspected a federal investigation was looming, they would instantly blacklist Bradley Thorne to protect their own assets. I systematically severed every single alternative credit line he possessed. I triggered minor breach of contract clauses on his secondary holding companies by exploiting loopholes Gregory found in his older contracts, forcing automated asset freezes across his smaller portfolios. I ensured that when Bradley inevitably realized his primary debt had been sold to a hostile, nameless entity, he would not be able to borrow a single dollar from anyone in the city to save himself. He would be entirely isolated, trapped in a financial cage of my precise design. Gregory leaned back in his chair, wiping his glasses with a silk handkerchief. He stated that Bradley would wake up as a billionaire on paper, completely unaware that his financial blood had been entirely drained while he slept. The trap was flawlessly constructed. We only needed to wait for Bradley to trigger the collapse by missing his next critical payment milestone. I thanked Gregory and dismissed him, instructing him to keep his secure phone close. I remained in my study as the sun rose, listening to the quiet hum of my terminal, feeling the immense, satisfying weight of absolute control. The heavy brass knocker on my front door echoed through the quiet house just past 9 in the morning. I locked my secure terminal, secured the basement door, and walked upstairs. I checked the security camera feed on my phone. Megan stood on my front porch. She was not accompanied by armed police officers this time. She was dressed in an immaculate cashmere coat and holding a designer handbag projecting the image of a wealthy, untouchable socialite. She tapped her expensive boots against my concrete steps with extreme impatience. I opened the door, maintaining the physical posture of an exhausted, defeated older man. Megan did not wait for an invitation. She pushed past me into the foyer, looking around my modest home with undisguised contempt. She turned to face me, her lips curling into a smug, victorious sneer. She announced that she was here to offer me a generous way out of a humiliating defeat. She stated that her lawyers were fully prepared to crush any attempt I made to contest the psychiatric commitment of my grandson. She claimed the judge was already siding with their prestigious medical expert, and I had absolutely no legal standing to interfere with her parental rights. She opened her leather handbag and pulled out a crisp physical check. She held it out to me between 2 manicured fingers. She told me the check was for exactly $50,000. She offered it as a permanent settlement, demanding I take the money, drop any future custody petitions, and disappear from Tyler's life forever. She looked around my hallway and told me a man living in a rundown Southside brownstone could use the cash to make his final years a little less pathetic. She stated that Corey had always been a failure who refused to provide a real life for her, and she was simply ensuring Tyler grew up with the wealth and status he deserved. Her arrogance was blinding. She truly believed she was buying off an uneducated, desperate laborer. She had no idea she was standing in the foyer of a man who possessed hundreds of millions of dollars in liquid capital. She had no idea she was threatening the exact man who had just bought her husband's entire company and the very mansion she slept in. I looked at the check. I did not throw it back in her face. I did not yell or demand she leave my property. I recognized the perfect strategic gift she had just handed me. I reached out with a trembling hand and took the check from her fingers. I lowered my head, playing the role of the broken grandfather submitting to a superior power. Megan let out a sharp, derisive laugh. She watched me lower my head and assumed she had completely broken my spirit. She crossed her arms over her cashmere coat, stepping closer to invade my physical space. She wanted to ensure I felt the absolute weight of my own supposed insignificance. She told me it was pathetic that it only cost $50,000 to buy a grandfather out of his own bloodline, but she was not surprised. She stated that Corey had the exact same weak, subservient mentality. She claimed my son lacked the killer instinct required to survive in the real world, and that was exactly why he ended up dead at the bottom of a frozen ravine. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the floorboards, allowing her to vent her toxic arrogance. She paced across my narrow foyer, the sharp heels of her designer boots clicking aggressively against the wood. She gestured wildly around my home, insulting the fading paint on my walls and the drafty windows. She called my house a crumbling museum of failure. She told me Tyler was destined for elite boarding schools, private estates, and the highest echelons of society. She insisted that my presence in his life would only drag him down into the same miserable working-class mediocrity that defined my existence. She pointed a manicured finger at my chest and laid out her final non-negotiable terms. She demanded I take the check to my local credit union, cash it, and immediately sign a legally binding non-disclosure agreement her lawyers had drafted. She warned me that if I ever attempted to call Tyler, approach his school, or show my face at the family court hearing, Bradley would unleash a legal team that would bury me in litigation until I died penniless. She reveled in her cruelty, entirely convinced she was the apex predator in the room. She was dictating terms to a man she believed was entirely powerless, utterly oblivious to the fact that she was standing on a trap door I had already rigged to open. I maintained my facade of complete submission. I allowed my hands to shake slightly as I held the crisp piece of paper. I looked up at her with manufactured hesitation and asked a deliberately foolish question. I told her I had never seen a check format like this before, noting the unusual string of characters printed beneath the signature line. I asked if my small neighborhood bank would even be able to process it. Megan rolled her eyes, letting out an exasperated sigh. She practically snatched the opportunity to educate a poor old man about the mechanics of elite wealth. She bragged that the check was drawn from a highly exclusive private wealth management tier, an institution that required a minimum deposit of $10 million just to open an account. She proudly pointed to the routing sequence, boasting that the funds were securely routed through an international clearinghouse, completely insulated from standard domestic audits. She smiled a razor-thin smile, telling me to just hand it to a bank teller and let them figure it out, assuming I lacked the cognitive capacity to understand the financial architecture she had just handed me on a silver platter. I nodded slowly, thanking her for her generosity, playing the utterly defeated elder to the very last second. She adjusted her expensive coat, gave me one final look of absolute disgust, and walked out my front door. I watched her climb into the back of her chauffeured luxury SUV. The moment her taillights disappeared down the snowy street, my trembling hands became completely still. The posture of the broken old man vanished instantly. I locked the heavy brass deadbolt. In the high-stakes world of corporate risk assessment, a check is never just a piece of paper. It is a digital map. It provides the exact geographical coordinates of an enemy's financial stronghold. Megan thought she was buying my silence. In reality, she had just handed a master cryptographer the master key to her most heavily guarded vault. I walked straight down to my basement study, locked the reinforced door, and booted up my air-gapped terminal. I sat at my mahogany desk and placed the $50,000 check under the bright glow of my desk lamp. I did not intend to cash it. I intended to dissect it. I typed the complex routing sequence into my secure tracking software. I bypassed the standard commercial banking firewalls and launched a deep-dive forensic audit using the ghost network I had cultivated over 40 years on Wall Street. I traced the international clearinghouse Megan had so arrogantly bragged about. The digital trail bounced through a labyrinth of shell corporations in Delaware, routed through a financial proxy in Luxembourg, and finally settled in a highly classified numbered offshore account located in the Cayman Islands. I initiated a brute force decryption protocol to pierce the account's ledger history. The software chewed through the security layers for 20 minutes before the screen flashed green. I was inside her private vault. I pulled the entire transaction history, scrolling past her recent luxury purchases to the very origin of the account. I found the exact date the portfolio was opened. It was established exactly 1 week after my son's funeral. I stared at the initial deposit amount glowing brightly on the monitor. It was a single lump sum transfer of exactly $5 million. The transaction serial number traced directly back to Corey's life insurance provider. The horrifying reality crystallized on my screen. Megan had not merged Corey's blood money with Bradley Thorne's massive real estate empire. She had secretly hoarded the life insurance payout in an untouchable offshore fortress, hiding it entirely from her new billionaire husband. It was her personal safety net, a massive stolen fortune she kept perfectly insulated while she spent Bradley's money in public. She had sold my son's life and stashed the profits in the dark. The $5 million sat there compounding interest over 6 years, serving as a grotesque monument to her betrayal. This was a monumental tactical vulnerability. Bradley Thorne was currently drowning in $500 million of over-leveraged toxic debt. He desperately needed liquid capital to save his company, completely unaware that his own wife was sitting on $5 million of hidden untaxed cash. I leaned back in my leather chair, a cold, calculating smile forming on my face. Megan had handed me the exact weapon I needed to shatter their marriage and destroy their unified front. If Bradley discovered she was withholding millions while he faced total bankruptcy, he would turn on her like a starving animal. The psychological warfare was about to become entirely mutual, and I was going to ensure she felt every single ounce of the terror she had inflicted on my grandson. I picked up the encrypted burner phone from my desk and dialed Gregory Shaw. He answered on the first ring. I told him we had a new target to add to our strike package. I transmitted the offshore routing numbers and the heavily encrypted ledger containing Corey's stolen $5 million life insurance payout. Gregory reviewed the data in real time, letting out a low, appreciative whistle. I instructed him not to simply leak this to Bradley Thorne. I wanted a total, instantaneous financial paralysis. I ordered Gregory to trigger an automated anti-money laundering red flag directly with the United States Department of the Treasury. We compiled a phantom dossier, cross-referencing Megan's offshore Cayman account with Bradley's domestic shell corporations creating a perfect digital illusion of massive international tax evasion. We invoked specific clauses under federal financial security acts that compel immediate mandatory asset freezes pending full federal audits. Gregory executed the cyber strike at exactly 10 in the morning. We watched the global banking nodes respond on my terminal. It was a masterpiece of financial destruction. The federal algorithms engaged, recognizing the massive undeclared offshore funds tethered to a high-profile real estate developer currently drowning in toxic mezzanine debt. The automated federal response was merciless. Within 45 minutes, federal holds slammed down like iron vault doors on every single liquid asset connected to both Megan and Bradley. Their personal checking accounts, corporate operational funds, offshore reserves, and high-limit credit lines were instantly locked. They could not withdraw a single dollar. They could not transfer a dime. They were completely financially severed from the rest of the world. I sat back and watched the green confirmation codes stack across my monitor. I had essentially turned their immense fortune into a digital mirage. They were billionaires trapped behind an impenetrable wall of federal bureaucracy. The oxygen in their corporate ecosystem was completely gone. I reminded Gregory to ensure the federal triggers specifically targeted the routing pathways Megan used for her daily expenditures. I wanted her to feel the impact immediately out in the open, far away from the insulated safety of her mansion. Gregory confirmed the locks were absolute. The bank managers would not be able to override the federal holds, nor would they be legally permitted to explain the exact nature of the freeze. Megan and Bradley were now completely blind and entirely broke. The immediate devastating reality of a federal asset freeze is that it strikes without any prior warning. Gregory kept a live trace on their transaction attempts, feeding me the data as it happened. At 1 in the afternoon, the terminal screen flashed with a series of aggressive, denied transaction codes. Megan was currently at a highly exclusive luxury boutique on the Magnificent Mile, a place where she regularly spent thousands of dollars to maintain her image among Chicago's elite socialites. The digital trace painted a vivid, humiliating picture. She attempted to charge $12,000 for designer accessories using her primary platinum credit card. The transaction failed instantly. I could perfectly visualize the scene. Megan standing at the polished marble counter adorned in her cashmere coat, offering a condescending smile to the sales clerk. That smile would vanish the second the machine beeped a hard decline. The tracking data showed she panicked and immediately swiped a second premium card. Declined. She tried a third card tethered directly to Bradley's corporate expense account. Declined. The terminal lit up with a rapid succession of denied codes as she desperately tried every single piece of plastic in her designer wallet. She was trapped in the middle of a high-end boutique surrounded by the wealthy peers she desperately sought to impress, suddenly exposed as a woman without a functioning cent to her name. Her entire identity was constructed on stolen capital and stolen status. When you strip away the designer clothes and the limitless credit limits, Megan was nothing but a frightened, hollow opportunist who had traded her soul for a lifestyle she could no longer afford. The tracking software indicated she immediately dialed Bradley's private banking concierge, but the automated federal lock prevented any human override. The sheer public humiliation of being declined at a luxury register is a unique psychological torture for someone obsessed with social hierarchy. She was forced to leave the merchandise on the counter and walk out empty-handed under the judgmental stares of the retail staff. She tried to hail a premium private car service to take her back to her mansion, but the app algorithm instantly rejected her frozen payment profile. Megan, the woman who had stood in my foyer hours earlier, demanding I take a $50,000 bribe, was now stranded on a freezing downtown sidewalk without the ability to buy a cup of coffee. The illusion of her supreme power had completely shattered in broad daylight. I watched the denied transaction alerts fade from my screen with deep satisfaction. I remembered how Corey used to describe her relentless hunger for status, her constant complaints about his modest surveyor salary. She murdered an honorable man to secure a fortress of wealth, completely unaware that a retired risk officer could demolish that fortress with a few keystrokes. She was finally experiencing the absolute powerlessness she had weaponized against my son. While Megan was experiencing a catastrophic social collapse, Bradley Thorne was facing total corporate annihilation. Gregory intercepted a frantic, unsecured email sent from Bradley's chief financial officer to the construction management team. The email detailed an impending disaster. Bradley had a massive non-negotiable payment due to the commercial construction union at exactly 6 o'clock the following morning. If the union did not receive their multi-million-dollar payroll transfer by dawn, They would orchestrate an immediate legally binding walkout. The heavy machinery would stop. The massive cranes would power down. The development site would go completely dead. The moment the site shut down, the New York private equity firm whose debt I now secretly owned would automatically trigger a default notice. Bradley was backed into a lethal corner. He could not access his domestic accounts. He could not tap into his shell companies. His entire empire was hours away from complete liquidation. Gregory managed to tap into the raw audio feed of Bradley's office security system, a vulnerability we discovered through a poorly secured smart hub. I listened through my headphones as Bradley paced his office, screaming furiously at his banking liaisons, demanding answers they were legally forbidden to provide. The heavy oak doors of his office slammed open. Megan rushed in, hysterical, shouting about her humiliated status and the frozen cards. Bradley did not comfort her. He yelled back, his voice cracking with pure desperation. He told her the company was entirely broke and the union was walking off the site tomorrow. He realized he could not wait for the scheduled family court hearing in 3 days. He needed liquid capital right this second. I listened as Bradley outlined a reckless, terrifying contingency plan. He told Megan they had to leverage Tyler's 5-acre land trust tonight. He planned to use the unpolluted parcel as collateral to secure a highly illegal overnight bridge loan from a syndicate of shadow lenders. But to pledge the land, he needed absolute legal authority over Tyler's estate immediately. Bradley shouted that they were completely out of time. They could not wait for a judge. He ordered Megan to get the car. They were going to drive to Dr. Alistair Croft's private clinic right now. Bradley vowed to physically force the corrupt psychiatrist to sign the final expedited incompetence decree tonight. Once Croft signed the emergency medical mandate, Bradley believed he could compel an overnight magistrate to grant temporary guardianship before dawn. The timeline had just accelerated violently. They were going after my grandson tonight. I disconnected the audio feed and stood up from my desk. The final battle was no longer a courtroom date in the future. It was happening right now. I grabbed my heavy wool coat and left the basement study. Gregory was already coordinating the legal intercept. Across the city, Bradley Thorne was unraveling completely. The audio feed we had tapped gave us his exact trajectory. He and Megan stormed into their sprawling mansion, screaming frantic orders at each other. They dragged my 10-year-old grandson out of his bedroom, completely ignoring his frightened protests. Tyler had no idea what was happening. He only knew the 2 adults who controlled his life were operating in a state of absolute violent panic. They threw him into the back of Bradley's luxury vehicle and sped through the dark Chicago streets toward the Gold Coast district. Their destination was the high-end private clinic of Dr. Alistair Croft. They bypassed the receptionist and marched directly into the doctor's plush mahogany-lined office. Bradley was sweating profusely, his expensive suit wrinkled, his eyes darting with the manic energy of a cornered animal. He slammed a thick stack of legal documents directly onto Croft's polished desk. It was the finalized psychiatric commitment mandate. The paperwork required only a single medical signature to authorize Tyler's immediate transfer to a locked state psychiatric ward. Megan pushed Tyler down into a heavy leather chair, gripping his small shoulders with bruising force. She instructed the boy to keep his mouth shut and stare at the floor. Bradley leaned over the desk, towering over the psychiatrist. He did not ask for a professional medical opinion. He issued a brutal, uncompromising directive. He ordered Croft to sign the paperwork right this second. Bradley explained rapidly that they were going straight to an overnight magistrate to secure the emergency conservatorship before dawn. He desperately needed the medical authorization to finalize the legal theft of Tyler's 5-acre land trust so he could use it as collateral for a shadow loan. Bradley threatened that if Croft hesitated for even a fraction of a second, he would terminate the clinic's corporate lease, seize all the expensive medical equipment, and completely ruin the doctor's career by sunrise. He demanded the signature that would effectively end my grandson's life as a free human being. Bradley stood there breathing heavily, completely convinced he held the ultimate leverage. He thought he was intimidating a subordinate employee. He had absolutely no idea that the battlefield had already been conquered and the war was already lost. Dr. Alistair Croft did not reach for his gold-plated pen. He did not cower under Bradley's aggressive physical posturing. He sat back in his ergonomic leather chair, folded his hands precisely in his lap, and looked at the billionaire developer with an expression of profound clinical detachment. Croft stated in a perfectly level voice that he would not sign the commitment forms under any circumstances. He announced that Tyler was completely sane and he would not be a party to the institutionalization of a healthy child. Bradley froze his face, turning an angry, mottled red. He slammed his fist against the desk, screaming that Croft worked for him and would do exactly as he was told. Megan gasped, demanding to know what was wrong with the doctor. They were completely oblivious to the fact that I had already visited this exact office 6 hours earlier. While Megan was standing in my foyer trying to bribe me with a $50,000 check, I was executing a flawless tactical maneuver. I had not come to Croft's clinic with physical threats or empty demands. I had walked into his office carrying a leather briefcase packed with absolute, undeniable financial devastation. During my audit of Croft's corporate lease, Gregory and I had dug deeply into the doctor's off-the-books billing practices. I laid out a comprehensive 60-page forensic ledger directly on Croft's desk. The documents detailed over $8 million in undeclared cash payments, illegal prescription kickbacks, and massive systemic tax fraud. I presented the doctor with a very simple binary choice. I told him I had a direct line to the criminal division of the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Medical Licensing Board. If he signed the papers committing my grandson, I would instantly transmit the dossier to federal prosecutors. Croft would lose his medical license, his lucrative practice, and spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary. However, if he flipped his loyalty and testified against Bradley Thorne, I would ensure his financial irregularities remained permanently buried. I offered him the ultimate currency in corporate warfare, which is self-preservation. Croft was a mercenary, and mercenaries always align with the superior force. I proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that my financial power vastly eclipsed Bradley's sinking empire. Croft chose to survive. He looked at Bradley and Megan, calmly informing them that their business arrangement was permanently terminated. Bradley completely lost his mind. He lunged across the mahogany desk, grabbing Croft by the lapels of his expensive suit, screaming that he would destroy him and everything he had built. Before Bradley could strike the doctor, the heavy oak doors of the clinic swung open. I walked into the room, flanked by 2 uniformed Chicago police officers and Gregory Shaw. The air in the office instantly plummeted to freezing. Bradley dropped the doctor and stumbled backwards, staring at me in absolute shock. Megan let out a sharp gasp, her hands flying away from Tyler's shoulders as if she had been burned by fire. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat or display any emotion. I simply looked at Tyler, giving him a firm, reassuring nod. I told my grandson to come to me. Tyler leaped out of the leather chair and ran across the room, wrapping his arms tightly around my waist. I placed a protective hand on his head, shielding him from the monsters who had terrorized him for 6 years. Gregory stepped forward, holding a blue legal folder. He handed a certified document directly to the lead police officer, then tossed a copy onto Croft's desk right over Bradley's fraudulent paperwork. Gregory announced that the game was over. Dr. Croft had not merely refused to sign the commitment forms. Under my strict directive, the doctor had spent the afternoon drafting a comprehensive, legally binding psychological evaluation of my grandson. Croft's official medical report stated that Tyler exhibited absolutely no signs of psychosis or violent tendencies. Instead, the document confirmed that Tyler was suffering from acute, severe emotional trauma resulting from systematic psychological abuse inflicted directly by Megan and Bradley Thorne. Armed with Croft's devastating medical affidavit, Gregory had approached an emergency family court magistrate just an hour ago. The judge reviewed the medical evidence of severe domestic abuse and acted with immediate judicial authority. Gregory pointed to the document on the desk, informing Bradley and Megan that it was an emergency removal order. The state had officially stripped Megan of her parental rights pending a full criminal investigation. The magistrate had granted me immediate temporary physical and legal custody of my grandson. Bradley was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically around the room as his entire strategy collapsed into dust. He had brought Tyler here to lock him away and steal his land. Instead, he had walked directly into a perfectly orchestrated legal ambush that permanently severed his access to the boy. I looked at Bradley and Megan, my voice as cold as the Chicago winter outside. I advised them to leave the building before the officers arrested them for trespassing. I held my grandson close, turned my back on their ruined empire, and walked out the door. The boy was finally safe, but I was not finished dismantling the men who killed my son. The freezing morning wind whipped across the concrete steps of the downtown family courthouse. I had just finalized the emergency custody injunction permanently barring Megan and Bradley Thorne from coming within 500 feet of my grandson. Tyler was currently safe in my secure brownstone, guarded by a private security detail Gregory had arranged before dawn. I zipped my heavy wool coat and walked down the wide granite stairs, feeling the immense satisfaction of a flawlessly executed legal victory. But cornered animals do not respect legal victories. They rely on primal desperate violence. Before I could reach my waiting vehicle, a black luxury sedan jumped the curb, its tires screeching against the icy pavement. The doors flew open. Bradley and Megan stormed out looking completely unhinged. The pristine billionaire facade was entirely gone. Bradley had not shaved. His expensive suit was crumpled and his eyes were bloodshot with a manic, dangerous rage. This morning, at exactly 6 o'clock, the Commercial Construction Union had officially walked off his mega-development site because his payroll accounts were frozen by the federal government. His $500 million project was officially dead in the water and his investors were screaming for answers. Bradley had lost everything in the span of 12 hours, and he blamed the 69-year-old grandfather standing calmly on the courthouse steps. He charged up the granite stairs like a raging bull, ignoring the shouting court officers and the shocked bystanders. He demanded that I hand over the boy and sign over the land trust right this second. He screamed that I had ruined his life, completely oblivious to the bitter irony of his words. Megan trailed behind him, her face pale, screaming obscenities and threatening to destroy my life. Bradley did not stop to negotiate. His mind had completely snapped under the crushing weight of total financial ruin. He believed he could use sheer physical brutality to break my will. He lunged at me with his fists raised, aiming a heavy, desperate swing directly at my face, intending to beat me into submission right there in the shadow of the legal system. He expected me to cower, freeze, or fall backward in terror. He expected an easy victim. He was drastically mistaken. During my 4 decades navigating the cutthroat corporate sectors of Chicago and New York, I did not just train my mind to anticipate financial disasters. I maintained absolute physical discipline. You cannot survive high-stakes boardroom warfare if your body betrays your anxiety. I practiced close-quarters defense for 30 years, treating my physical conditioning with the same ruthless dedication I applied to my stock portfolios. I did not flinch or raise my hands to block. I simply read the clumsy telegraph trajectory of his punch and stepped smoothly to the left. Bradley's own massive momentum betrayed him. His fist swung through empty air. He lost his footing on the icy granite and crashed violently face first into the unforgiving stone steps. The impact echoed sharply across the courtyard. He groaned in pain, clutching his bleeding nose, completely humiliated in front of the gathering crowd of lawyers and court personnel. I looked down at him with absolute freezing contempt. I did not raise my voice or gloat. I simply reached into the inner breast pocket of my wool coat and withdrew a single folded sheet of thick legal paper. I tossed it down onto the freezing granite right in front of his bleeding face. I told him to read it. Bradley blinked through his pain, his trembling hands picking up the document. It was a formal notice of mortgage acquisition. The paper clearly stated that his primary lender had sold the entire debt portfolio of his massive personal estate to Vanguard Apex Acquisitions. I watched his eyes widen as the realization struck him. I leaned down slightly and informed him that Vanguard Apex Acquisitions was my blind proxy corporation. I told Bradley that I was the nameless entity who bought his mezzanine debt the night before. I did not just ruin his mega development. I legally owned the very roof over his head. I informed him that because of his missed union payments this morning, he was officially in breach of contract. I told him that my legal team was currently initiating foreclosure protocols, and he had exactly 24 hours to vacate his sprawling mansion before my private security contractors physically threw his belongings onto the street. Megan gasped, covering her mouth in absolute horror as the reality of their total homelessness sank in. Bradley stared up at me from the cold stone, his spirit completely broken. He had tried to crush an old man with physical violence, only to realize he was fighting a financial leviathan who had already bought the ground beneath his feet. I adjusted my coat, turned my back on the ruined billionaire, and walked calmly to my waiting vehicle. Bradley scrambled off the frozen pavement, his face smeared with blood and his mind racing with pure, unadulterated panic. He dragged Megan back into their idling sedan and sped away from the courthouse. He was completely out of options. The federal government had frozen his offshore cash. A hostile proxy firm owned his commercial debt, and the grandfather he had vastly underestimated now held the legal deed to his personal mansion. He could not borrow money. He could not negotiate. He was staring down the barrel of total catastrophic bankruptcy and a highly probable federal indictment for environmental fraud. But Bradley Thorne was a man who had already crossed the ultimate moral boundary. 6 years ago, when Corey threatened his empire, Bradley did not hesitate to orchestrate a fatal car crash. Now facing an even greater existential threat, he defaulted to the exact same ruthless methodology. I listened to the raw audio feed of his vehicle, which Gregory had successfully cloned through Megan's compromised mobile device. Bradley was gripping the steering wheel, screaming that they were not going to lose everything to a retired accountant. He realized that the only way to save his $500 million mega development and appease his furious investors was to physically secure the land deed to the unpolluted 5-acre parcel. If he possessed the original physical trust documents, he believed he could still forge my signature, backdate the transfer, and use his corrupt municipal contacts to push the construction permits through before the federal auditors completely closed in. He pulled his sedan into a deserted parking garage on the outskirts of the city. He told Megan to shut her mouth and stop crying. He pulled out a disposable, prepaid cell phone he kept hidden in the glove compartment. I listened with chilling clarity as he dialed a number and connected with a highly organized, violent criminal syndicate he had used in the past to intimidate rival contractors and clear out stubborn tenants. He did not ask for a simple burglary. He requested a highly professional, heavily armed extraction team. He offered them a massive guaranteed payout from a shadow account he promised to unlock once the mega development resumed. He gave the mercenaries my exact address on the south side. He provided them with the blueprints to my brownstone, which he had pulled from municipal records. He ordered the extraction team to breach my home tonight under the cover of darkness. He instructed them to use whatever lethal force was necessary to bypass my security rip, open my basement safe, and physically extract the original land trust documents. He explicitly commanded them not to leave any witnesses behind. Bradley Thorne had officially authorized a hit squad to raid my home and murder me in cold blood. He believed he was initiating a masterstroke of violent problem-solving. He had absolutely no idea that I was listening to every single word, and I had already prepared a devastating welcome for his hired killers. The freezing wind howled through the empty streets of the south side, masking the sound of the black tactical van pulling up to the rear alley behind my brownstone. The digital clock on my terminal read exactly 2 a.m. I watched the live feed from my high-definition security cameras as 4 men stepped out into the snow. They were not common street thugs. They moved with the chilling synchronized precision of highly trained military contractors. They wore matte black tactical gear, heavy ballistic vests, and thick balaclavas that obscured their faces. Each man carried a suppressed automatic weapon, their fingers resting disciplined on the trigger guards. Bradley Thorne had spared absolutely no expense. He had purchased a premium execution squad to erase my existence and secure his $500 million empire. The intruders bypassed my exterior gate with a specialized thermal cutter, melting the heavy iron lock in mere seconds. They advanced across the frosted courtyard, stacking up against the reinforced steel of my back door. The lead operative attached a hydraulic breaching ram to the hinges, completely confident that brute force would grant them immediate access to their target. They expected to find a sleeping, vulnerable grandfather. They expected a quick, violent extraction of the land deed, followed by a seamless escape into the Chicago night. The heavy door groaned and gave way under the massive hydraulic pressure, splintering the oak frame with a loud, violent crack. The squad flooded into my kitchen, sweeping the dark corners with the green beams of their weapon-mounted lasers. They moved silently up the hardwood stairs, clearing the bedrooms with ruthless efficiency. They kicked open doors and tore through closets, leaving no space unchecked. They found the master suite empty. They found Tyler's room perfectly made and unoccupied. The lead mercenary signaled his team to pivot downward, their tactical boots making no sound on the polished wood. They descended the narrow stairs into the basement, moving directly toward my mahogany-lined study. Bradley had provided them with the exact architectural blueprints of my home. They knew the floor safe was embedded deep within the reinforced concrete wall behind my desk. They breached the study door, fanning out to secure the perimeter of the room. The leader holstered his weapon and pulled a heavy, diamond-tipped drill from his tactical pack, stepping directly up to the steel face of my vault. He believed he was moments away from extracting the trust documents that would save Bradley Thorne's life. He had no idea he had just walked into the center of a perfectly designed mousetrap. I watched the entire operation unfold on a grid of high-definition monitors, sitting comfortably in a luxury downtown penthouse miles away from the danger. The moment I intercepted Bradley's desperate phone call that afternoon, I immediately initiated my evacuation protocols. Gregory Shaw dispatched a private, heavily armored transport vehicle to my brownstone before the sun even set. I moved Tyler out of the house and secured him in a fortified suite owned by my blind proxy corporation, entirely off the grid and protected by armed security personnel. I did not leave my home empty by accident. I left it as a carefully constructed snare. During my 4 decades as a chief risk officer, my responsibilities extended far beyond auditing corporate ledgers and offshore accounts. I engineered the physical security architecture for subterranean gold vaults and multi-billion-dollar data centers. I knew exactly how professional extraction teams operated, and I had retrofitted my own basement study 15 years ago to meet the exact specifications of a high-level corporate panic room. The safe embedded in my wall was not designed to hold valuable documents. It was a mechanical decoy rigged to a sensory network. The moment the mercenary pressed his diamond-tipped drill against the steel faceplate of the safe, he triggered the room's defensive countermeasures. A loud, violent metallic clack echoed through the basement. The heavy oak door of the study, reinforced with a hidden core of ballistic steel, slammed shut with bone-crushing force. Electromagnetic locks engaged, instantly sealing the doorframe with 10,000 pounds of unbreakable resistance. Simultaneously, thick titanium shutters dropped rapidly over the small basement windows, locking into the concrete foundation. The 4 armed mercenaries whipped around, raising their suppressed weapons, their green lasers slicing frantically through the dark. They rushed the steel door, kicking and ramming their shoulders against the barrier, but it did not yield a single fraction of an inch. They were completely sealed inside an airtight, impenetrable concrete box beneath the frozen Chicago soil. The red standby lights in the corners of the ceiling shifted to a brilliant, piercing white. 4 hidden high-definition cameras activated, capturing every single angle of their panic in crystal-clear resolution. The hunters were suddenly paralyzed, realizing they had been entirely outmaneuvered by the man they were sent to slaughter. I leaned forward in my leather chair inside the downtown penthouse and pressed the activation button on my secure microphone. My voice blasted through the hidden surround sound intercom system installed in the ceiling of the basement study. The sudden booming baritone caused the 4 mercenaries to flinch their weapons, tracking uselessly toward the hidden speakers. I spoke with absolute terrifying calm. I welcomed them to my home. I informed them that the room they were currently standing in was structurally reinforced with military-grade steel and possessed its own independent ventilation system, which I had just remotely deactivated. I stated clearly that no amount of ballistic firepower could penetrate the door, and their cellular signals were entirely jammed by the lead-lined walls. They were completely cut off from the outside world, and their oxygen supply would reach critical lethal depletion in exactly 45 minutes. The lead mercenary shouted into the room, demanding I open the door, threatening to burn my house to the ground. I did not raise my voice in response. I simply presented them with a cold binary choice. I told them I had a direct line to Gregory Shaw, who was standing by to transmit the live video feed of their faces directly to the federal authorities. They could choose to suffocate in the dark, or they could choose to survive by giving me exactly what I wanted. I demanded a full, unedited video confession. I ordered them to state their full names, their criminal affiliations, and the exact parameters of the contract they accepted tonight. I commanded them to look directly into the camera lens and state unequivocally that Bradley Thorne had hired them to commit armed robbery and first-degree murder. The mercenaries exchanged panicked, desperate looks. They were professional killers, but they were not zealots willing to die in a concrete box to protect a bankrupt real estate developer. The lack of oxygen was already playing on their psychological endurance. The leader dropped his weapon onto the hardwood floor. He pulled off his thick balaclava, revealing a scarred, sweating face. He looked directly up at the glowing red lens of my primary camera. He stated his true name. He detailed the exact amount of money Bradley had wired to their shadow account. He recited Bradley's explicit instructions to murder me and extract the land deed at any cost. The other 3 men followed suit, dropping their rifles and confirming the murder-for-hire conspiracy on crystal-clear audio and video. I watched the files upload instantly to Gregory's secure servers, locking the undeniable evidence into an ironclad digital vault. I had not just defeated Bradley Thorne's violent contingency plan. I had weaponized his own mercenaries against him, securing the ultimate criminal leverage. I engaged the ventilation system and remotely unlocked the heavy steel door, ordering them to leave my property immediately. They fled into the freezing night, leaving their weapons behind. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the digital calendar on my monitor. Tomorrow morning was Bradley's massive, highly publicized, groundbreaking gala for his $500 million mega development. He believed the hit squad had succeeded. He believed I was dead, and he was completely free to forge the land trust documents in front of the mayor and his billionaire investors. He had absolutely no idea that I was holding the video confession that would publicly and permanently end his entire existence. The green progress bars on my terminal monitors reached 100% simultaneously. The high-definition video confessions of the four mercenaries had successfully propagated across 7 independent, heavily encrypted offshore servers located in jurisdictions that did not recognize United States subpoenas. I watched the timestamps lock into the unalterable blockchain ledger. I leaned back in my leather chair and watched the digital confirmation codes cascade down the screen. I possessed the absolute, undeniable evidence required to send Bradley Thorne to a maximum security federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. The video files did not merely contain coerced admissions of guilt. The lead mercenary had meticulously detailed the entire financial architecture of the murder-for-hire conspiracy. He provided the exact routing numbers of the shadow accounts Bradley used to fund the operation, the specific dates the contracts were finalized, and the precise instructions to murder me and extract my grandson's land deed at any cost. This was not circumstantial evidence. It was an ironclad, bulletproof criminal indictment wrapped in a digital vault. I picked up the encrypted burner phone and dialed Gregory Shaw to confirm the data transfer. He answered immediately, his voice sharp and alert despite the extreme hour. I informed him that the trap at the brownstone had triggered flawlessly, the physical threat was entirely neutralized, and we now held the ultimate criminal leverage. Gregory let out a low, steady breath, acknowledging the sheer magnitude of the weapon we had just acquired. He stated that we no longer needed to rely solely on the environmental fraud documents or the offshore tax evasion files to destroy Bradley. We held a direct recorded confession of attempted first-degree murder. In the high-stakes arena of corporate warfare, a financial crime will ruin a man's bank account, but a violent felony will permanently erase his existence. I stared at the frozen image of the scarred mercenary on my monitor. Bradley Thorne had sent armed killers into my home expecting to wake up to the news of my violent death. He expected a clean, ruthless resolution to his $500 million problem. I locked the terminal screen and stood up, feeling a cold, dark satisfaction settling deep within my chest. I had successfully transformed his lethal contingency plan into the exact instrument of his absolute ruin. Gregory Shaw immediately shifted into his role as a ruthless legal tactician. He urged me to transmit the video files directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Chicago Police Department right this second. He argued that with this level of explicit recorded evidence, federal prosecutors could secure a no-knock arrest warrant before dawn. We could have federal tactical teams tearing down the reinforced doors of Bradley Thorne's mansion while he slept, dragging him and Megan out in handcuffs before the morning news cycle even began. Gregory insisted that a swift, overwhelming police raid was the most logically sound method to permanently eliminate the threat they posed to my grandson. I listened to his aggressive legal strategy without interrupting, but I shook my head in the dark penthouse. I explicitly vetoed the police raid. I told Gregory that handing the evidence over to the authorities right now would be a monumental tactical error. During my 4 decades executing high-level corporate audits, I learned a fundamental truth about extremely wealthy predators. If you arrest a billionaire in the quiet hours of the morning, you give him the shadows to operate within. Bradley would immediately deploy a phalanx of elite defense attorneys. He would leverage his political connections, post an exorbitant cash bail, and spend the next 5 years dragging the prosecution through endless appeals and procedural delays. I refused to grant him the dignity of a quiet legal battle. I did not want him negotiating plea deals behind closed doors. I wanted a public execution. I wanted them to feel the exact same sheer, suffocating terror they had inflicted on my son and my grandson. I reminded Gregory that when I dismantled corrupt financial institutions on Wall Street, I did not simply terminate the executives in private. I exposed their frauds on the trading floor, ensuring they lost their wealth, their status, and their legacy simultaneously in front of their peers. I intended to apply that exact same methodology to Bradley Thorne. Tomorrow morning was the highly publicized, groundbreaking gala for his $500 million mega development. He had invited the mayor, the city council, the press, and the elite syndicate of private investors who funded his empire. I wanted Bradley and Megan to ascend to the absolute pinnacle of their social and financial power. I wanted them to stand under the bright lights of the media completely convinced they had won the war. And then I wanted to drop the floor out from under them in front of the entire city. Gregory absorbed my command in silence. He recognized the ruthless brilliance of the strategy, confirming he would prepare the final digital assets for tomorrow's exhibition. Miles away in the opulent master suite of his sprawling mansion, Bradley Thorne was entirely oblivious to the catastrophic failure of his mercenary strike team. The hired killers had fled into the Chicago night, dropping their burner phones to avoid any digital tracking, leaving Bradley completely in the dark regarding the disaster at my brownstone. His towering arrogance filled the silence. He simply assumed the radio silence meant the operation was a flawless success. He believed my body was currently lying on the floor of my basement, and the mercenaries had successfully secured the original land trust documents. Dawn broke over the city, signaling the arrival of the most important day of his professional life. The grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive luxury hotel was already being prepped for the massive, groundbreaking gala. Banners displaying the logo of Bradley's corporation hung from the vaulted ceilings. Caterers arranged towers of crystal champagne glasses, and audio technicians tested the heavy microphones on the main stage. Bradley stood perfectly still in front of his full-length mirror, adjusting the collar of a bespoke tuxedo. Megan stood behind him, fastening a diamond necklace around her throat, wrapping herself in the illusion of untouchable wealth. She smoothed the fabric of her designer gown, convincing herself that the nightmare of her frozen credit cards was just a temporary administrative glitch that Bradley would magically fix today. They were preparing to celebrate the launch of their $500 million empire, completely ignorant to the fact that their entire ecosystem was a dead husk. Bradley picked up a sleek leather portfolio resting on his dressing table. Inside the portfolio lay a pristine, entirely fabricated legal document, since he believed he now possessed the physical leverage of my death. He had spent the early morning hours meticulously forging my signature and Tyler's signature on a fraudulent transfer of trust. He intended to stand at the podium, flash the forged documents to the flashbulbs of the press, and legally absorb the unpolluted 5-acre parcel into his corporate holdings. He believed the forged deed was his golden ticket to securing his over-leveraged loans and appeasing his furious investors. He practiced his victory speech in the mirror, rehearsing the exact cadence of his lies, practicing the solemn tone he would use to announce my sudden tragic passing to the business community. He was a dead man walking meticulously, tying his own noose. He gathered his forged documents, took his wife by the arm, and stepped out into his waiting limousine, fully prepared to claim his kingdom. He had absolutely no idea that I was already dressed, armed with the digital weapons of his destruction, and waiting for him at the center of his own celebration. The grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hotel was a masterpiece of manufactured opulence designed to project an illusion of infinite prosperity. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the 300 hand-picked guests. The city's financial elite, high-ranking municipal officials, and powerful media executives mingled effortlessly, sipping vintage champagne, while a string quartet played softly in the background. Massive digital screens anchored the far ends of the ballroom, displaying pristine, high-resolution architectural renderings of Bradley Thorne's $500 million mega-development. It was a flawless, glittering facade masking a catastrophic financial void. At exactly 8 o'clock in the evening, the lights dimmed and the murmuring crowd fell silent. Bradley Thorne stepped into the spotlight, commanding the center stage. He wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo, projecting the unshakable confidence of a titan who had conquered the city. He did not look like a man whose personal accounts were frozen by federal auditors. He did not look like a man whose entire corporate empire was currently defaulting on $500 million in toxic mezzanine debt. He looked completely invincible. Megan stood slightly behind him to his right, wearing an exquisite emerald gown, smiling radiantly for the flashing cameras of the local press. She was the perfect corporate wife, a stunning accessory supporting a visionary leader. Bradley tapped the microphone, his deep, practiced voice echoing smoothly across the cavernous room. He thanked the mayor for his unwavering support and acknowledged his primary investors who were seated at the front tables. He spoke passionately about urban renewal, community revitalization, and his commitment to building a legacy that would redefine Chicago's skyline. He was laying the groundwork for his ultimate deception. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a thick, official-looking document. He held it up for the cameras, his smile widening into a triumphant grin. He announced that he held the finalized, fully executed land trust deed for the final 5-acre parcel required to break ground tomorrow morning. He was proudly holding the forged signature of my murdered son, fully prepared to lie to 300 of the most powerful people in the state to secure his fraudulent empire. I stood in the shadows near the grand entrance of the ballroom, watching the performance with absolute freezing calm. The private security detail guarding the VIP sector was formidable, composed of imposing men wearing communication earpieces and dark suits. When I approached the velvet ropes, the lead guard immediately moved to block my path, extending a heavy hand to halt my progress. He politely but firmly informed me that this section was strictly reserved for primary investors and executive board members, and my name was not on the immediate guest list. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or attempt to physically bypass him. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my bespoke Italian suit and handed him a laminated, highly classified financial directive drafted by Gregory Shaw. The document possessed the official seal of Vanguard Apex Acquisitions. I instructed the security guard to review the primary sponsorship registry for the evening's event. The guard glanced at the paper, his professional demeanor faltering instantly. The document proved that Vanguard Apex Acquisitions was not merely an investor. Vanguard Apex legally owned the entire commercial debt portfolio of the hotel, the catering company, and the corporate entity hosting the gala. The guard was technically standing on my property, being paid by funds routed through my proxy firm. He stared at the document, then looked up at me, his eyes wide with sudden realization. He quickly unclipped the velvet rope and stepped aside, bowing his head in deference to absolute financial authority. I walked past the security checkpoint and entered the VIP sector, moving with the silent, predatory grace of a man who had spent 4 decades dismantling executives exactly like Bradley Thorne. I bypassed the tables of chatting investors and wealthy socialites, my focus locked entirely on the brilliantly lit stage. I had spent the last week operating in the dark, orchestrating strikes from a subterranean study, hiding behind proxies and encrypted networks. Now I was stepping directly into the light. I was not hiding anymore. I was arriving to collect the debt they owed my son. I reached the edge of the stage just as Bradley began outlining his fictitious construction timeline. Megan, scanning the crowd with her usual arrogant vigilance, spotted me instantly. The radiant, practiced smile vanished from her face as if she had been struck by lightning. The champagne glass slipped from her manicured fingers, shattering violently against the polished hardwood stage. The sharp crash caused a ripple of confusion among the front row guests, but I did not stop moving. Bradley, distracted by the noise, turned his head toward his wife, his triumphant expression faltering as he followed her terrified gaze. He saw me ascending the short flight of stairs to the platform. The sheer impossibility of my presence physically paralyzed him. He had paid heavily armed mercenaries to murder me in my home. He firmly believed my body was currently lying on the floor of my basement, thousands of dollars poorer with the original land deed extracted. Seeing me standing there, impeccably dressed and entirely uninjured, shattered his reality. He stood frozen at the podium, the forged document trembling in his hand. I did not hesitate. I walked directly to the center of the stage, my eyes locked onto his, projecting a level of cold, lethal certainty that completely overpowered his panic. I reached out and wrapped my hand around the neck of the heavy microphone. Bradley tried to pull back his mouth opening to protest, but his vocal cords failed him. He was completely outmatched by the sheer gravity of the moment. I stepped into his personal space and easily stripped the microphone directly from his grip, forcing him to step away from his own podium. I turned to face the 300 elite guests, the flashing press cameras, and the furious, confused investors. The ballroom fell into an absolute, breathless silence. The background music stopped. The murmurs died away. I held the microphone steadily, feeling the immense weight of the truth I was about to unleash. I looked out over the sea of wealthy faces, ready to publicly and permanently execute the man standing beside me. "Good evening," I began, my voice resonating through the state-of-the-art sound system. The sheer normalcy of my greeting stood in stark contrast to the absolute tension vibrating off the stage. I introduced myself clearly as Lawrence Hayes, the former chief risk officer of Chicago's largest financial institution, and more importantly, the grandfather of the boy whose land Bradley Thorne was currently attempting to steal. A low murmur of confusion rippled through the VIP tables. Bradley lunged forward to intervene, but I simply raised a hand, shooting him a look of such absolute lethal authority that he froze mid-step. I reached into my pocket and pressed a single button on a small encrypted remote Gregory had synced to the hotel's audiovisual hub. Instantly, the massive, glittering architectural renderings of the $500 million mega development vanished from the giant screens behind the podium. They were replaced by stark black and white federal environmental assessments, chemical toxicity charts, and heavily redacted offshore banking ledgers. The gasps from the audience were immediate and audible. I commanded the room to look closely at the screens. I guided their attention to the soil samples taken directly from the center of Bradley's proposed construction site. I explained in precise clinical detail that the ground beneath their multi-million-dollar investments was saturated with lethal carcinogens and heavy metals. I laid out the exact mathematical reality. Bradley Thorne had deliberately bypassed $50 million in mandatory environmental purification. He bribed municipal inspectors to bury toxic waste under cheap concrete, ensuring that every single permit attached to this project was entirely fraudulent and subject to immediate federal condemnation. I pointed to the glowing red numbers of the Cayman Islands account on the secondary screen, exposing the stolen $5 million life insurance payout Megan had hoarded. I told the investors they were not backing a visionary real estate developer. They were financing a catastrophic environmental crime orchestrated by a desperate bankrupt fraud. I paced the stage, making direct eye contact with the wealthiest stakeholders seated in the front row. I broke down the exact chemical composition of the polluted bedrock, reading directly from the whistleblower dossier my son had compiled before his death. I made it absolutely clear that if a single shovel pierced that soil tomorrow, the Environmental Protection Agency would lock down the entire district, seizing every asset tied to the development. The glittering promise of luxury condominiums was a toxic graveyard. The investors began to whisper frantically among themselves, their champagne glasses abandoned, their cell phones suddenly appearing in their hands. I did not give them a moment to recover. I pivoted smoothly from the environmental catastrophe to the absolute financial ruin of the man standing trembling to my left. I addressed the primary investors, directly calling out the managing partners of the private equity firms by name. I asked them if they truly understood the leverage architecture of the man they had trusted with their capital. I projected Bradley's internal corporate ledgers onto the screens, stripping away his billionaire facade layer by layer. I revealed the exorbitant mezzanine loan he had secured from New York, explaining the brutal, unyielding penalty clauses attached to it. I laid bare his complete lack of liquid capital. I narrated the events of the past 24 hours with the cold precision of a medical examiner conducting an autopsy. I informed the room that Bradley Thorne had missed his critical payroll transfer to the Commercial Construction Union at exactly 6 o'clock this morning. I announced that the heavy machinery was currently idle, the cranes were powered down, and the site was officially paralyzed by a massive legally binding walkout. The murmurs in the front row escalated into angry, panicked shouts. Bradley tried to speak, stepping toward the microphone to utter a denial, but his voice cracked, rendering him entirely mute. I directed the crowd's attention back to the screens, switching the display to the automated federal holds placed on Bradley and Megan's personal accounts. I explained the mechanism of a federal asset freeze triggered by extreme offshore tax evasion and money laundering algorithms. I stated clearly that Bradley Thorne could not access a single domestic bank account. He could not leverage his holding companies. His wife could not even purchase a cup of coffee without her platinum credit cards declining. They were entirely severed from the global financial ecosystem. I told the investors that Bradley was standing before them in a bespoke tuxedo attempting to project invincibility, while he was entirely incapable of paying his own legal fees. He had built a sprawling empire on a foundation of toxic dirt and stolen blood money, and the structural integrity of that empire had completely failed. I watched the realization wash over the faces of the city's elite. The men and women who had praised Bradley Thorne minutes ago now looked at him as if he were carrying a highly infectious disease. They realized their hundreds of millions of dollars were tied to a sinking anchor. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Investors pushed their chairs back, shouting demands for immediate explanations. High-ranking municipal officials signaled their security details, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive scandal. I raised my voice, cutting through the sheer panic with absolute booming authority. I demanded their attention for the final terminal revelation. The room fell into a terrified, breathless hush. I turned to Bradley, who was currently sweating through his tuxedo, his chest heaving with silent, hyperventilating terror. I introduced the name Vanguard Apex Acquisitions to the crowd. I reminded the investors that Vanguard Apex was listed as the primary sponsor of tonight's gala. I projected the final, most devastating document onto the massive screens behind me. It was the official countersigned contract from the New York private equity firm confirming the complete transfer of Bradley's toxic mezzanine debt. I announced to the room that Vanguard Apex Acquisitions was not a faceless corporate entity. It was my blind proxy corporation. I informed Bradley Thorne, the mayor, and every single investor in the room that I had personally purchased the entire $500 million debt portfolio in the dead of night. I looked directly into Bradley's terrified, bloodshot eyes. I told him that I legally owned the mortgage to his sprawling personal mansion. I owned the idle construction equipment sitting on his poisoned dirt. I owned the corporate holding companies he used to shield his wealth. I outlined the exact breach of contract clauses he had violated by missing the union payments this morning and defaulting on the construction timeline. I did not leave him a single margin for error or negotiation. I held the microphone firmly and delivered the killing blow. I announced loudly and clearly for the official record that I was calling in the $500 million debt effective immediately. I stated that he had exactly 24 hours to produce $500 million in liquid cash, a physical impossibility given his federal asset freeze. I officially declared his corporation bankrupt, nullified his development contracts, and initiated immediate foreclosure on every single asset bearing his name. I bankrupted a billionaire live on stage in front of the entire city. The sound of his empire shattering was deafening. Bradley stumbled backward, clutching his chest as if the air had been physically ripped from his lungs. Megan sank to her knees in her designer gown, sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of their total, inescapable ruin crashed down upon them. They had tried to steal my grandson's land, and in return I had completely erased their existence. Bradley Thorne stared at the massive digital screens, his chest heaving as the absolute finality of his ruin crashed down upon him. The polished, invincible facade of the billionaire real estate titan completely dissolved, leaving behind a terrified, cornered animal. He stumbled backward, his expensive tuxedo suddenly looking like a borrowed costume on a shrinking man. He looked out at the 300 elite guests, his eyes wide with a frantic, unfiltered panic. He realized his wealth, his reputation, and his freedom had evaporated in a matter of minutes. He snapped. He pointed a trembling, sweat-slicked finger at me and screamed at the top of his lungs that I was completely insane. He shouted to the furious investors that I was a grieving, delusional old man who had fabricated a massive, sophisticated digital hoax to extort him. His voice cracked with hysteria as he commanded his private security detail to seize me, but the guards remained frozen, terrified of the staggering financial power I had just demonstrated. Realizing no one was coming to his rescue, Bradley scrambled desperately toward the side of the stage. He threw himself at the heavy audiovisual equipment rack hidden behind the velvet curtains. He tore at the thick black cables connecting the main projection array to the hotel power supply. Sparks flew violently across the polished hardwood as he violently yanked the primary power cords from their sockets, desperately trying to plunge the grand ballroom into darkness. He believed that if he could just kill the screens and erase the glaring evidence of his financial crimes, he could salvage a fraction of his credibility. He panted heavily, his hands bleeding from the sharp wires, screaming orders at the hotel management to cut the main breaker to the entire floor. He completely underestimated the depth of my tactical preparation. I do not rely on fragile hotel infrastructure to execute a strike of this magnitude. Gregory Shaw had anticipated this exact primal reaction. He did not route my presentation through the hotel's vulnerable internal network. He established an independent, heavily encrypted cellular uplink directly to the projectors powered by localized high-capacity battery backups hidden within the staging equipment itself. Bradley's frantic destruction of the cables achieved absolutely nothing. The massive screens flickered for a mere fraction of a second before the backup relays engaged seamlessly, glowing even brighter than before. I raised the microphone, my voice slicing effortlessly through Bradley's hysterical screaming. I announced to the silent, terrified room that his financial ruin was merely the prologue to his actual crimes. I pressed a secondary command sequence on my encrypted remote. The toxic environmental ledgers and offshore banking records vanished from the giant screens. A stark, pitch-black background replaced them, displaying a simple, glowing green audio waveform. The grand ballroom fell into a dead, suffocating silence as a familiar, crystal-clear voice filled the cavernous space. It was Corey, my son. The audio diary was the final, heavily encrypted file he recorded in the front seat of his car the very morning he died. Corey's voice echoed off the crystal chandeliers with a chilling, resolute calmness, detailing exactly how Bradley Thorne had threatened his life the night before. Corey stated clearly for the record that he had discovered the tampered brake lines on his vehicle, but chose to proceed to the Environmental Protection Agency office anyway to ensure the toxic dumping was permanently exposed. He explicitly named Megan as an active accomplice, explaining how she provided Bradley with his daily route and schedule in exchange for a promised cut of the corporate profits. Megan shrieked a raw, guttural sound of pure terror. She covered her ears and buried her face in the polished floorboards of the stage, utterly paralyzed by the voice of the husband she had sold to the slaughter. Before the shock could fully process in the minds of the audience, the screens shifted from the audio waveform to a high-definition video feed. The image displayed the scarred, sweating face of the mercenary leader trapped inside my concrete basement vault just hours ago. The stark, brutal reality of the underground bunker stood in jarring contrast to the glamorous ballroom. The mercenary looked directly into the camera lens and confessed unequivocally that Bradley Thorne wired $50,000 to a shadow account to finance a lethal home invasion tonight. The killer detailed Bradley's exact premeditated instructions to murder me in cold blood and extract my grandson's land trust deed by any means necessary. The visual evidence of a coordinated, heavily armed hit squad combined with the ghostly voice of a murdered son utterly destroyed any remaining shred of doubt in the room. The reaction within the ballroom was instantaneous and catastrophic. The polite, wealthy facade of the gala disintegrated into sheer, unadulterated panic. The primary investors, men and women who controlled billions in global capital, scrambled away from the front tables in absolute horror. They knocked over crystal champagne flutes and floral centerpieces, pushing past each other in a frantic rush toward the exit doors. They treated Bradley as if he were covered in a highly contagious plague, desperate to physically and legally distance themselves from a man publicly exposed as a ruthless murderer and a federal criminal. The mayor of Chicago, sitting just 2 rows away, turned a deep shade of purple with righteous outrage. He violently motioned for his armed municipal security detail, shouting at the top of his lungs for the immediate apprehension of Bradley Thorne. The flashbulbs of the local press went into a blinding, relentless frenzy, capturing every single agonizing second of the billionaire's absolute, inescapable downfall. The wail of police sirens began to echo in the distance, growing rapidly louder as multiple tactical units converged on the Palmer House Hotel, summoned by the automated distress signals Gregory had strategically tripped. Bradley stood completely alone on the stage, abandoned by his peers, his investors, and his security. He looked at the fleeing crowd. The furious politicians and his sobbing wife collapsed at his feet. The crushing magnitude of his total annihilation finally penetrated his panicked, hyperventilating mind. He had absolutely no money, no company, no allies, and no future outside the concrete walls of a federal penitentiary. His bloodshot eyes locked onto mine. The frantic desperation in his gaze vanished, replaced by a dark hollow and absolute murderous rage. He realized he had absolutely nothing left to lose. I was the man who had methodically and publicly dismantled his entire universe, and he decided in that exact second to drag me down into hell with him. Bradley reached into his tailored jacket, pulling out a heavy, solid silver commemorative statuette he had intended to present to the mayor later that evening. He gripped the weighted metal base like a lethal bludgeon. He let out a primal, guttural roar that tore through his throat, completely abandoning any remaining shred of human decency or self-preservation. He charged across the polished hardwood of the stage with lethal, unchecked velocity. He raised the heavy metal weapon high above his head, aiming a crushing killing blow directly at my skull, intending to silence me in front of the flashing cameras and the screaming crowd. The heavy silver statuette blurred as it descended toward my skull, driven by the frantic, uncoordinated strength of a man who had completely lost his mind. Bradley Thorne swung with lethal intent, but he lacked discipline. He swung with the wild, desperate energy of a corporate bully who had never faced genuine physical adversity. I did not retreat. I did not raise my arms in a panicked defense. During my decades managing high-stakes corporate risks, I learned that a charging enemy is an unbalanced enemy. I waited for the exact fraction of a second when his forward momentum became entirely irreversible. As the weapon arced downward, I pivoted sharply to my right, stepping seamlessly off his center line. Bradley's massive swing cleaved through empty air, completely destabilizing his center of gravity. I seized the opening instantly. I drove the heel of my palm upward in a precise, devastating strike directly against the hinge of his extended elbow, hyperextending the joint with a sickening crack. Bradley screamed, dropping the silver statuette as his arm collapsed. Using his own unchecked momentum, I swept his lead leg, driving him face first into the polished hardwood of the stage. The impact knocked the wind entirely out of his lungs, leaving him gasping and pinned to the floor. I stood over him, smoothing the lapels of my suit, my breathing perfectly regulated. At that exact moment, Gregory Shaw raised his hand from the VIP section. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom blasted open. Dozens of heavily armed tactical officers from the Chicago Police Department, flanked by federal agents wearing dark windbreakers, flooded the room. They swarmed the stage with overwhelming synchronized force. The officers bypassed the terrified guests and converged directly on the fallen billionaire. 4 officers hauled Bradley off the ground, slamming him roughly against the podium while they wrenched his uninjured arm behind his back. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping around his wrists echoed through the silenced ballroom. The physical threat was entirely neutralized. The execution was complete. Megan was dragged to her feet by 2 federal agents, her exquisite emerald gown snagging and tearing on the splintered wood of the stage. The pristine, arrogant facade of the untouchable socialite had completely dissolved into a pathetic display of sheer panic. She thrashed against the agent's grip, her perfect makeup ruined by streaks of mascara and frantic, hyperventilating tears. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a desperate, calculating terror. She attempted one final, desperate manipulation. She screamed my name, begging me to call off the agents, pleading that she had no choice, that Bradley had forced her into the conspiracy. She wailed that she was Tyler's mother, and that sending her to prison would destroy my grandson's life. I looked at her with an expression of absolute freezing zero. I did not raise my voice, but my words cut through the chaotic noise of the ballroom like a scythe. I reminded her that Corey had loved her, provided for her, and trusted her, and she had traded his beating heart for a mansion built on poisoned dirt. I stated clearly that she was not a victim of Bradley Thorne. She was the architect of her own destruction. I recalled the moment she stood in my foyer just hours ago, arrogantly offering me a $50,000 bribe, utterly convinced she was a superior breed of human. I stripped away her final illusion of power, informing her that I had already secured the emergency custody injunction. Tyler was completely safe, surrounded by my private security, and he would never have to look at her face again. I told her that she did not care about her son, she cared about his land, and now she possessed absolutely nothing. The wealth she murdered my son for was entirely frozen. Her reputation was public ash, and the rest of her natural life would be spent wearing a state-issued uniform in a concrete cell. She sobbed violently, her legs giving out, but the federal agents held her upright by her arms, entirely unmoved by her theatrical despair. The lead federal agent read Bradley and Megan their Miranda rights, his voice projecting a cold administrative finality over the buzzing crowd. Bradley did not fight back. The pain in his shattered elbow and the absolute destruction of his billion-dollar empire had completely hollowed him out. His eyes stared blankly at the floorboards, his spirit utterly broken. The officers turned the 2 prisoners around and marched them toward the center aisle of the ballroom. This was the exact pathway Bradley had planned to walk down as a conquering king. Instead, it became the route of his ultimate, inescapable disgrace. The local press corps, recovering from their initial shock, surged forward. The blinding flashes of high-intensity cameras strobed relentlessly, capturing every single humiliating second of their perp walk. Journalists shouted questions, demanding comments on the environmental fraud, the embezzlement, and the murder charges. Bradley and Megan were dragged through the gauntlet of flashing lights and glaring cameras, their ruined faces permanently etched into the digital history of the city. The wealthy elite, the investors and the politicians who had clinked champagne glasses with them mere minutes ago, now turned their backs, averting their eyes to avoid any association with the radioactive scandal. The heavy wooden doors of the Palmer House Hotel closed behind the federal agents, sealing Bradley and Megan's fate forever. The massive digital screens on the stage remained illuminated, displaying the irrefutable evidence of my son's murder and the toxic foundation of a bankrupt empire. The ballroom was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the reckoning they had just witnessed. I stood at the center of the stage, smoothing the cuffs of my bespoke suit. Gregory Shaw walked up the stairs carrying his silver briefcase and stood silently by my side. I looked out over the sea of stunned investors and terrified corporate executives. They now understood exactly who I was and the absolute terrifying lengths I would go to protect my bloodline. I did not offer a closing statement or stick around to answer the frantic questions of the press. I had achieved my singular objective. I stepped off the stage, walking through the parted crowd with the calm, steady pace of a man who had successfully settled an impossible debt. The men who murdered my son were heading to federal prison, and my grandson was finally safe. The weeks following the gala unfolded with the mechanical precision of a federal guillotine. The United States Department of Justice did not merely indict Bradley Thorne and Megan, they buried them under a mountain of irrefutable, deeply documented felonies. The charges ranged from environmental terrorism and massive wire fraud to conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. They were denied bail instantly. The presiding judge deemed them extreme flight risks, citing the frozen offshore accounts and the recorded mercenary confessions Gregory Shaw had seamlessly delivered to federal prosecutors. They were stripped of their bespoke suits and designer gowns, confined to separate maximum security holding cells without a single luxury to cushion their spectacular fall. When predators are cornered, their loyalty completely evaporates. The federal prosecutors knew exactly how to exploit the absolute moral bankruptcy of their marriage. They offered each of them a singular, highly restricted plea deal. The first person to fully confess and testify against the other would avoid the federal death penalty. Bradley broke first. He sat in a sterile interrogation room and detailed exactly how Megan had provided Corey's exact driving route on the morning of the fatal crash. He claimed he was merely a businessman protecting his investment, while his wife was the true cold-blooded architect of her husband's demise. Megan retaliated with a ferocity born of pure panic. She provided federal agents with the exact locations of Bradley's remaining hidden ledgers. She outlined his history of bribing municipal judges and ordering violent intimidation tactics against rival contractors. She painted Bradley as a homicidal megalomaniac who forced her into compliance through severe psychological terror. The local media feasted on the daily leaks from the courthouse. The glittering power couple of Chicago real estate was reduced to a pair of feral animals fighting over scraps of survival. They completely dismantled whatever thin defense their expensive lawyers attempted to build. They did exactly what I calculated they would do. They consumed each other. While they destroyed each other in federal court, I remained inside my basement study, executing the final permanent financial adjustments. The legal authority I held over Bradley's ruined empire was absolute. Through Vanguard Apex acquisitions, I initiated the immediate aggressive liquidation of every single corporate and personal asset Bradley Thorne possessed. I seized the sprawling mansion where my grandson had been a prisoner, stripping it bare and selling the property to a rival developer at a severe discount just to erase its memory from the city records. I auctioned off his idle cranes, his fleet of luxury vehicles, and his entire portfolio of secondary holding companies. I did not keep a single dollar of his polluted fortune for my own gain. I channeled the entirety of the liquidated capital directly into a specialized, irrevocable trust dedicated solely to environmental remediation. I formally transferred the deed of the 5-acre unpolluted parcel, along with the surrounding toxic wasteland, directly to the Environmental Protection Agency. I funded the purification effort entirely with Bradley's own liquidated wealth. The carcinogenic soil he tried to pave over would be excavated, purified, and transformed into a sprawling public green space in the center of the city. I ensured his legacy would not be a towering glass skyscraper, but a public park bearing the name of the man he murdered. Corey Hayes Memorial Park would stand as a permanent monument to my son's unwavering integrity. My final maneuver targeted the Cayman Islands offshore account. Using the federal fraud indictments as irrefutable leverage, Gregory Shaw and I compelled the International Clearinghouse to repatriate the stolen $5 million life insurance payout. The bank recognized the money was directly tied to a federal homicide investigation and surrendered the funds immediately to avoid secondary prosecution. I secured the repatriated capital and locked it inside an impenetrable multi-generational trust fund. The sole beneficiary was Tyler. I designed the trust structure with relentless precision. No outside party predatory lender or future legal guardian could ever access a single cent of the principal. Megan's desperate blood-soaked safety net was entirely erased, transformed into the exact financial shield that would guarantee my grandson a life of absolute untouchable security. The financial battlefield was completely sanitized. The swift and brutal efficiency of the federal justice system finalized the execution exactly 4 months after the gala. Bradley and Megan stood before a federal judge, shackled at the waist and ankles, their hollow eyes staring at the polished mahogany bench. The judge did not offer an ounce of leniency. He described their actions as a breathtaking display of unparalleled corporate greed and profound moral depravity. He stated that their willingness to murder a husband, orchestrate an environmental catastrophe, and attempt the violent institutionalization of a healthy 10-year-old child required the absolute maximum penalty under federal law. Bradley Thorne was sentenced to consecutive life terms in a maximum security penitentiary without the possibility of parole. Megan received a 50-year sentence for her direct complicity in the murder and the subsequent financial fraud. They were led out of the courtroom through separate doors, permanently banished to the darkest, most isolated corners of the penal system. They would never see each other again. They would never touch another dollar of stolen wealth. Most importantly, they would never look upon the face of my grandson for the rest of their natural lives. I sat in the back row of the gallery, watching the heavy oak doors close behind them. I did not smile. I did not celebrate. I simply stood up, adjusted the cuffs of my coat, and walked out into the crisp Chicago morning. The immense suffocating shadow that had hung over my family for 6 long years was permanently eradicated. The predators who hunted my bloodline were entirely exterminated. I had dismantled a billionaire, manipulated the federal government, and shattered a criminal syndicate to protect the only family I had left. I walked down the granite steps of the courthouse, feeling a profound, absolute stillness settling deep within my chest. I stepped into my waiting vehicle, instructing the driver to take me back to the South Side. The war was officially over. The threat was erased. 6 months passed with quiet grace. The South Side brownstone no longer felt like a subterranean bunker preparing for a siege. The heavy blackout curtains were drawn back, allowing the bright late spring sunlight to pour across the polished hardwood floors. The smell of fresh coffee and toasted brioche filled the kitchen. I sat at the mahogany dining table, resting my reading glasses on the bridge of my nose. Tyler sat across from me, a plate of scrambled eggs half-eaten in front of him. He did not flinch at sudden noises anymore. He did not clutch a worn backpack in terror or look over his shoulder expecting a monster to kick down the door. He was a 10-year-old boy reclaiming his childhood. He slid a thick piece of cardstock across the smooth wood. I picked it up and reviewed the printed columns. It was his final semester report card from the new private academy I had enrolled him in. A perfect, unbroken vertical line of exemplary grades in mathematics, advanced sciences, and literature. He had achieved the highest academic honors in his entire grade. I looked over the top of my glasses at my grandson. He sat up completely straight, projecting a quiet, steady pride. I did not offer him empty, exaggerated praise. I gave him the exact same firm, respectful nod I used to give his father. I told Tyler that excellence is not an accident. I told him it is the direct result of disciplined focus and an unbreakable will. He smiled, a genuine, bright expression that reached all the way to his eyes. The terrified, shivering boy who had arrived on my porch at 3:18 in the morning was entirely gone. In his place sat a brilliant, resilient young man who knew exactly who he was and exactly how much he was valued. I poured myself a fresh cup of black coffee and watched him run upstairs to gather his baseball equipment for his afternoon league game. The quiet hum of the house allowed my mind to settle into a profound state of reflection. The silent adjustment was absolutely complete. The world outside my heavy oak doors had moved on to new corporate scandals and different headlines, but the architecture of my family's future was now set in impenetrable stone. I did not merely dismantle Bradley Thorne and Megan to satisfy a primal urge for revenge. Revenge is an emotional, reckless endeavor that often destroys the architect alongside the target. I executed a calculated terminal restructuring of a toxic ecosystem. I had ripped the predators out of the food chain to ensure my bloodline could thrive without constantly looking over their shoulders. I thought about the massive, irrevocable trust fund currently compounding interest in a highly secured tier of the global banking system. Tyler was completely insulated by the repatriated $5 million of his father's stolen life insurance. When he turned 18, he would step into adulthood not as a victim of a broken home, but as a heavily armored financial titan. He would inherit the unpolluted 5-acre parcel of land in the city center, which the federal government had just finished certifying as the future site of the Corey Hayes Memorial Park. He would never have to compromise his integrity for a paycheck. He would never have to bend the knee to arrogant billionaires or ruthless developers. I had successfully converted the worst tragedy of our lives into an unbreakable shield of multi-million-dollar armor. The legal adoption papers had cleared through the family court system flawlessly 3 months ago. I was no longer an estranged, distant figure in his life. I was his father in the eyes of the law and his absolute protector in the eyes of the world. The transition required grueling work. We spent countless hours with specialized trauma therapists carefully untangling the psychological damage Megan had inflicted on him for 6 years. We built a new routine based entirely on mutual respect, rigid honesty, and unconditional support. I taught him how to play chess in the basement study, showing him how to anticipate an opponent's moves and control the center of the board. I taught him the same lessons in risk management I had once taught Corey. Tyler's heavy footsteps echoed cheerfully down the hallway as he carried his baseball glove toward the front door. He called out, telling me he was ready to go. I told him to wait in the car, tossing him the keys to the armored SUV I had recently purchased. I listened to the heavy brass deadbolt click shut as he stepped out into the warm afternoon sun. The house fell into a deep, comforting silence. I walked slowly into the living room and stood before the large stone fireplace. Resting on the mantel was a silver-framed photograph. It was a picture of Corey taken the day he graduated from his environmental engineering program. He was looking directly at the camera, projecting that same fierce, uncompromising integrity that ultimately cost him his life. I reached out and gently straightened the silver frame. I did not feel the crushing, suffocating weight of grief that had paralyzed my chest for the past 6 years. I felt a tremendous, liberating lightness. I had looked evil directly in the face and completely eradicated it from the earth. I had taken the shattered remnants of my family and forged them into something entirely unbreakable. I spoke to the photograph in the quiet room. I told my son that the debt was paid in full. I told him the boy was safe, the land was clean, and his murderers were buried in concrete cells for the rest of their natural lives. I promised him on his deathbed that I would protect his bloodline, and I had kept that promise with absolute, uncompromising brutality. I stepped away from the mantel, adjusting the cuffs of my shirt. I walked toward the front door to join my grandson. I stepped out into the bright Chicago sunlight, locked my home, and breathed in the fresh spring air. My dignity was fully restored. My family was secure. I had achieved absolute peace. The ultimate lesson here is that true power never needs to announce its presence. Arrogance is a loud disguise for profound vulnerability. Megan and Bradley believed their wealth made them invincible because they measured strength in mansions and stolen bank accounts. They mistook my silence for weakness and my patience for surrender. They forgot that the most dangerous opponent is the one who lets you believe you are winning until the steel trap snaps shut. Never let anyone underestimate your worth. If this true story resonated with your own battles, click the like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts below.